Aegon Targaryen was 79 years old on the day he walked alone across the charred ruins of the old dragon pit on Rhaenys' Hill. The once majestic dome, said to have rivaled the greatest halls in Essos, lay in shattered stone and twisted metal. The ancient statue of Meraxes, carved in black marble, had collapsed into rubble. But if one looked carefully enough at the crumbling edifice, the faint outline of the dragon's awe-inspiring shape still lingered in the stones. Aegon's hair was no longer the coruscating silver it had been in his youth. Age had stripped it of its sheen, fading it to a pale ghost of that Targaryen brightness, but it still hung regal around his narrow shoulders. He wore a dark cloak and favored a cane he had carved himself from weirwood many years ago, though the proud conqueror would never stoop enough to admit how badly he needed it. He cast his violet gaze across the piles of rubble and scorch marks. Even after decades of effort, the memories of war were never fully erased. In the distance, a dusty wind howled across King's Landing. The city had grown under his hand, from mud-caked streets to a bustling metropolis with new brick avenues, open squares for gathering, and newly constructed theaters and academies. And yet there was still so much left to do. Change, as Aegon had discovered, was a flame as temperamental as any dragon's breath. It caught quickly in some corners, but in others it starved for air. In certain hearts it was embraced. In others it bred only resentment. He had arrived alone to avoid ceremonial fuss. In every corner of this capital, people clamored to witness him, the conqueror in the twilight of his life, a living myth who had defied the kingdoms of Westeros and reshaped them through fire and blood. But he would never allow himself to forget that he had not come to rule by the love of the small folk, at least not in the beginning. He had come on the back of Balerion the Black Dread. Aegon Targaryen, first of his name, king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, had stolen his throne through conquest and then spent a lifetime trying to reforge the realm into something greater than the spoils of war. He did not regret the conquest, for it had been inevitable, and he believed he had saved more lives than he had ended. Yet in the last 20 years or so, new ideas, new dreams, and new ambitions had taken root in his mind. Perhaps the days of conquest were indeed necessary to bring the Seven Kingdoms together, but that was not enough for him anymore. Aegon had seen visions of a realm united not just by Targaryen might but by justice and fairness. He had seen the cramped alleyways of Flea Bottom and the scattered huts of blacksmiths who never tasted true prosperity. He had felt the frenzied beating of peasants' hearts when they bowed to him, fear underlying every movement. And in private, when every guard had been dismissed and he was alone with his own conscience, he had asked himself, had he built anything truly new, or had he only put a different figure atop the same feudal chaos? The questioning had led him on a long journey, not physically, though he had once circled the Seven Kingdoms on Dragaback to ensure his dominion, but spiritually as he wrestled with the ghosts of his ambition. A younger man might have assumed democracy was not but a heresy of the free cities, a concept foreign to the traditions of Westeros. But age had brought Aegon humility. He had outlived both his sisters, he had seen his children reach maturity and some die too soon, he had watched as petty lords and ladies sought advantage, their alliances weaving a Byzantine tapestry of intrigue. He had listened as the small folk whispered about a day when the common man could decide the fate of the realm. And instead of laughing, he had pondered. Aegon turned from the battered ruin of the dragon pit and made his way down the slope. The cane pressed down on uneven gravel, and each step seemed an echo of his lifetime. A hush lay over that broken ground. None had ventured near for many years, not since the day a trio of rebellious dragon-keepers had attempted to raise a new brood without his blessing. Their efforts had died in the stale darkness beneath the collapsed dome. No new dragons had come forth. Some said that the dragons had died out in truth, that the last Targaryen behemoths had vanished from the earth. Yet whispers also claimed that deep in the bowels of this ruin there was a single hidden egg that might yet stir to life under the right conditions. Aegon knew how the realm still yearned for living dragons. Their presence had always been a symbol of Targaryen rule, a sign of might, and some still believed them a sign of the gods' favor. But the aging king had come to see how that same symbol also froze men in fear. At the bottom of the hill waited young Rhaegar Waters, barely 20, a squire of ambiguous parentage and a mind blazing with curiosity. He wore a plain gray tunic, traveling boots, and had tied-back hair of straw-colored curls. Rhaegar had insisted on accompanying Aegon, not out of duty but out of an earnest devotion. Aegon had told him many times, "I need no more worship from men," and Rhaegar had replied that worship was not what he offered. Instead, Rhaegar wanted to learn, to see, to understand. "Where do you find your courage, my king?" the youth asked. How do you believe so thoroughly in new ways for Westeros? Aegon had no easy answer, so he told him to observe. That alone had seemed enough for the young man. There you are, your grace, Rhaegar said softly, had bowed in respect but not subservience. His face lit with concern. You look troubled. Merely remembering, Aegon replied, leaning on his cane. He cast one last glance at the blackened silhouette of the old dragon pit. Come. We must return to the keep. My counselors will be assembling soon. You have the measure for the new assembly on your mind? Rhaegar asked, stepping in beside him. Mind, heart, and soul, the king answered, with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Today is a fateful day. We set the stage for tomorrow's vote. If the lords accept it, Westeros changes forever. Rhaegar's eyes shone. They shall see your wisdom, my king. Aegon allowed himself a dry chuckle. Let us hope. Or at least let us hope that enough of them are wise, or afraid, or cunning enough to allow it. He did not bother to hide his bitterness. Even with all his authority, forging a democracy, an actual, stable institution that gave genuine representation to the small folk, had proven more difficult than subduing the continent by dragonfire. This had never been about mere decrees. He could not seize men's consciences as he had seized their castles. If he wanted the new government to endure beyond his lifetime, it could not be established purely by fear of the Conqueror. It had to have its own roots. The sun hung low in the sky by the time they neared the Red Keep. The fortress glowed in the last brazen light of dusk. Built on Aegon's orders, completed decades earlier, its red stones were a testament to Targaryen might, but also to his ambitions. When he had commissioned the castle, he had still been enthralled by the might of the dragon. He had demanded it be built near the mouth of the Blackwater, strategically placed to watch over the city that bore his name. The castle's formidable towers, heavy gates, and labyrinthine walls had deterred all manner of uprising. Not once since its completion had an enemy host set siege to its battlements, though many had plotted within its walls. The guardsmen on duty bowed deeply, yet Aegon caught the flicker of curiosity in their eyes. The rumor that the king wished to surrender certain prerogatives to a council of representatives, some elected by the small folk, had spread like wildfire. The idea was unthinkable to many. It challenged all the old ways, from the bleached bones of the first men's traditions to the rigid feudal codes of the Undals. And it drew the same question from friend and foe alike. Why would a king, especially a Targaryen, the blood of the dragon, willingly diminish his own authority? The torchlit corridors inside were familiar to Aegon, every niche and stone a silent witness to the hush of his footfall. He made his way to the council chamber where his allies and, truth be told, enemies waited. Rhaegar parted from him at the threshold, offering to fetch wine or carry messages, but Aegon shook his head. I'd have you remain by my side today. He paused, pressing his weight onto his cane. You ask many questions, lad. You deserve to see the answers for yourself. The squire's face brightened as though the older man had handed him a sword of Valyrian steel. Within the council chamber, a wide oaken table held in its center the painted map of Westeros. Candles burned at each corner, and several figures in various garb, velvet doublets, plain tunics, or silk robes, crowded around its edges. They were the King's Council, though some might name them the King's Cabal, or the King's Burdens, or the King's greatest foes, depending on the day. The faces of a few flickered with annoyance when the monarch entered. As was customary, they all bowed. Aegon waved the gesture off. He wanted no obeisances for the moment. He took his seat at the head of the table with a care that belied his age and placed his cane against the chair. My lords, my ladies, he said, letting his voice resonate. Even at his age, it commanded the room. We have matters to attend to, matters that will shape our realm's destiny. Lord Torrhen Stark, descendant of the king who knelt, inclined his head, though his eyes were shrewd. We have read your proposals, your grace. His voice was quiet, measured, the North incarnate. Ser Davos Bar Emin, a knight from Sharp Point who had somehow risen high in the king's confidence, gave a grunt of assent. He was not a man of many words, but he believed strongly in the ideas Aegon championed. Meanwhile, Lady Meredith Hightower, clad in emerald velvet, seemed to study the old Targaryen's face as if to see if the man was truly serious. Her slender fingers traced a pattern on the table's edge. Rumor said she had the ear of nearly half the lords in the Reach, and her approval or condemnation could sway countless allies. But none weighed on Aegon's mind so much as the man near the table's far end, Lord Daemon Valerion, master of ships whose house had long been staunch supporters of House Targaryen. Yet in recent years, Daemon's closeness to certain fractious lords had grown. He wore a fine doublet embroidered with silver krakens and seahorses, a potent symbol that he might be courting the Greyjoys as allies. Daemon was a tall man, with hair so pale it could have passed for Targaryen silver in poor light. His face was composed, a polite mask of courtesy that concealed a labyrinth of ambition. "We gather at your pleasure, your grace," he said, bowing his head. "Yes," Aegon said, "and I thank you for your presence." He exhaled slowly, scanning them each in turn. "Let us begin." His voice echoed in the chamber. There would be no illusions or half-measures. He had summoned them to finalize the measure that would codify an assembly, a great council, or parliament, or some new name they had yet to agree upon, where each region of Westeros would send elected envoys drawn not only from the nobility but from the common folk as well. It would have the authority to propose laws, negotiate levies, and adjudicate critical matters that once rested solely in the crown's hands. In short, it was a radical departure. At first, the discussion was civil. They spoke of the number of seats, the ratio between small folk representatives and noble houses, and the method by which such elections might take place. The king's hand, Lord Corley Spewire pointed to the map as if measuring the domain. The Crownlands, the North, the Vale, the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, the Iron Islands, and Dorne, he recited. 9 separate regions. The proposal is that each region sends a certain number of delegates. The question remains how many. If we make the numbers too uneven, some regions will hold too much sway. Yet if we equalize them completely, regions with smaller populations may hinder the larger ones. Lady Hightower interjected, her voice like the gentle hiss of a blade. "We have farmland, yes, but also a large population in Old Town. Why should the North, with its spread-out holdings, receive as many delegates as the Reach?" Lord Torrhen answered with chilly courtesy. "Because the North is vast, milady. The distance between the Carhold and Bear Island alone is enough to swallow many of your southern domains, and has precious little farmland." Daemon Valerion snorted. "Are we apportioning delegates by farmland now? If we are, perhaps the Iron Islands should have none. They grow naught but salt and rocks." The quip raised a few subdued laughs, but it also showed the tension in the room. The Iron Islands were notoriously fractious. Aegon raised a hand, and silence fell. "We'll find a compromise. The principle must be that each region's representation reflects its importance without drowning out others. The exact formula can be refined over time." "Refined over time?" Lady Hightower tapped her nails on the table. "We must ensure the system won't be manipulated by unscrupulous hands." Aegon inclined his head. "Just as any system can be manipulated. That is why we must build checks and balances. No single house or faction must be allowed absolute power. Not even House Targaryen." That admission rattled them. Some, like Bar Emmon, nodded in agreement. Others, like Valerion, seemed uncertain how to respond. The hush spooled out as Aegon's words settled. Declaring his own house not above reproach was akin to spitting in the face of centuries of Targaryen supremacy. And so the arguments continued. It was near midnight when the last of the counselors rose. The once orderly table was strewn with parchment, half-drained cups of mulled wine, and shattered quills. Aegon's bones ached, but he refused to close the session prematurely. They would endure as he endured, forging the shape of Westeros's future. By the time they finished, they had hammered out a few more details. Delegates for the proposed assembly would be chosen for 3-year terms, re-elected through a method that each region would manage, some by open gatherings in market squares, others by local councils, still others by counting marked tokens. The notion of such elections was met with no small measure of skepticism and scorn, but Aegon pressed relentlessly. He pointed to the tradition in some of the free cities, like Braavos, where the Sea Lord was chosen, albeit by a restricted oligarchy. "We can do better," he said. "We will do better." When at last the candle flames were guttering, flickering on the verge of dying, Aegon rose. His cane squeaked slightly against the floor. He saw the weariness in their eyes, the questions and resentment swirling just beneath the surface. He offered them a respectful nod. "I thank you, my lords and ladies. May the gods bless your slumbers. On the morrow, I shall bring this to the full gathering of lords, knights, and representatives who have traveled here. Then we shall see what the future holds." They murmured pleasantries. Bowing, they filed out. Some offered expressions of grudging support or at least acceptance, while others wore heavy frowns and left in stony silence. Demon Valerian was the last to go. He paused at the doorway, half-turned, and regarded the aging Conqueror with something like pity. "Rest well, your grace," he said softly. "I know you believe in this course, but I pray you have the strength for what is to come." Aegon regarded him with cool dignity. "I have found strength in surprising places, Lord Valerian. I trust one may do so again." Demon bowed, a silent, mocking flicker in his gaze, and then was gone. Aegon exhaled. Rhaegar stepped forward from the corner where he'd stood, watching. "He doubts you," the youth said softly. "They all doubt you. Perhaps. But doubt can be conquered." Aegon moved to the table and picked up a piece of parchment. His eyes scanned the scrawl of penmanship, a summary of the day's negotiations. "We must be ready for the public assembly. I will give my speech and then the lords will vote. And if they refuse? If they vote to reject it?" Aegon smiled faintly. "Then we try again. The realm is not built in a single day. Still, I suspect we'll have enough support. Lords who sense the shifting winds and maybe even some who share the dream. The small folk want a voice. The question is only whether the High Lords will yield or risk angering them. I have not spent the last 5 decades bridging divides for naught." Rhaegar touched the hilt of an old sword at his belt, an heirloom from his father, rumored to be a sellsword from Essos. "Let me stand guard tomorrow, your grace. Just in case. You think I'm in danger? There are rumors. Whispers of the faith militant stirring. Others say certain lords might hire cutthroats to ensure your measure never sees the light of day. You trust too readily." Aegon's laugh was wry. "I have spent years building trust, boy. It is the only coin that spends in the hearts of men. Still, I appreciate your concern. You may stand guard, though I doubt there will be an open attempt on my life." That night, Aegon Targaryen did not sleep easily. He found himself wandering the corridors of the Red Keep in the small hours, his cane echoing on the stones. Past the bedchamber that once belonged to his beloved sister Visenya, she who had famously wielded the Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister. He paused. It had been years since she passed, but her memory lingered like a shadow in every corridor. She had been fierce, unyielding, a war goddess in mortal form. She might have called him mad for trying to give power to the small folk. "Use the fear of the dragon," she would have said. "Let them tremble, for it's all that keeps them loyal." Rhaenys, his other sister, might have been more sympathetic. She had always been kinder, more in tune with the hearts of the people, but even she would question whether the small folk had the learning, the discernment to rule themselves. "Maybe they do not," Aegon murmured in the darkness, "but if they never learn, Westeros will remain forever as it is." He thought of all the suffering he had witnessed, famines in the north, bloody feuds between riverland lords that left peasants homeless and starving, rapacious knights who forced themselves upon villagers for sport. He remembered the day he had listened to a small boy of the Crownlands describing how his mother died of an infected wound, unable to pay a maester's fee. These tragedies might not vanish overnight under a new system, but if the realm's governance no longer belonged solely to the squabbling of lords, then perhaps these pleas would at least be heard. Even a step in that direction might be enough to set a different path. Morning came at last. It brought bright sunshine over King's Landing, a crystalline warmth that gilded the spires of the city. A gentle breeze drifted inland from Blackwater Bay, bringing a scent of salt and fish. The royal retinue assembled in the courtyard outside the Great Hall. Commoners peered over the palace gates, hoping for a glimpse of the fabled Conqueror. Scores of petty lords, wealthy merchants, and foreign dignitaries milled about, many sporting their house sigils or flamboyant attire. The swirl of colors and chatter was enough to make one's head spin. Aegon entered the great hall with measured dignity. Tapestries depicting scenes from the conquest lined the walls. Above he dais at the far end, the iron throne loomed, an ugly mass of twisted swords fused by dragonfire. He had once sat upon it with pride and confidence, heedless of the sword's edges. Over the years, it had cut him more times than he cared to admit. A silent reminder that no king was truly safe upon that seat or from the burden of power. Now, as he approached, he allowed himself a moment's reflection on how it all began. When he had for the first time led his sisters across the sea, riding dragons to unify the 7 kingdoms by force, he could never have guessed he would stand here decades later, preparing to unravel the absolute power he had once seized. The hall was packed with benches. The High Lords sat at the front, the Lesser Lords and landed knights behind them. Farther back, under the watchful eyes of the King's Guard, stood representatives of the small folk, guild masters, craftsmen, outspoken peasants whose local communities had chosen them for this extraordinary day. The hush that fell as Aegon arrived was profound. Hundreds of eyes fastened upon him. He walked with his cane, refusing any assistance, head held high. He stopped before the dais, turning to face the gathered throng. A raised wooden podium had been placed there, so he did not ascend the iron throne. He stood at the podium, cleared his throat softly, and spoke. "My people," he began, his voice carrying with surprising clarity in the hush. "I stand here not as a conqueror but as a servant of the realm. Decades ago, I united Westeros with Dragonfire. I claimed a crown through force, intending to bring peace and stability to these lands. And for a time, that was enough." He paused. The memory of Balerian's roar seemed to echo in his mind. "But as I have grown older, I have seen that unity cannot rely forever on fear. My sisters and I believed we were forging a new age by breaking the old kingdom's lines of division. Yet after the conquest, the struggles continued in subtler forms. Lords squabbled. Rivalries persisted. The small folk remained voiceless, their needs overshadowed by the demands of their liege lords. A king cannot sit idle on his throne while injustice festers. He surveyed them, noticing the varied reactions. Shock, curiosity, anger, or quiet, rapt awe. "I have dreamt of a Westeros that belongs to all who live within it. That dream has led me to propose what some of you may find radical, or even heretical. But I stand by it. I propose that we create an assembly of the realm, one that will include not only the great lords, but also elected representatives of the small folk." A faint stir of murmuring broke out among the benches. Aegon let it subside, then continued. "This assembly would share in the making of laws, in levying taxes, and in deciding matters of war and peace. It will not replace the crown altogether, nor will it strip the lords of their lands. But it will ensure that no single voice goes unheard. The details have been arranged by my council, though I'm sure they will change and improve over time. What matters is that we take this step now together." He lifted a hand, quiet authority in the gesture. "We stand on the cusp of a new age. We can remain bound by old feuds and power structures, or we can build something greater." For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if a dam had burst, the hall erupted in noise. Aegon stood, letting them vent. The lords in front bristled, muttering among themselves, while the small folk at the back strained forward to hear more. 100 different voices rang out. Finally, at the podium's side, Lord Corley Spire raised his arms for quiet. One by one, the lords quieted. Aegon spoke again. "I will not impose this upon you by Dragonfire. If we are to embark upon this path, it must be by the will of the realm. I ask each region to vote, whether by its lords, its local leaders, or other means, on whether this assembly shall stand. Those in favor, let them so declare, those opposed, likewise." A heavy silence followed. Slowly, Lord Torrhen Stark rose, the direwolf of House Stark emblazoned on his cloak. He glanced around, eyes resting on a few northern lords who nodded encouragement. "The North has ever been stubborn," he began, voice echoing. "We remember the harsh cold, the times when help from the southern lords was scarce. Yet we also remember the cost of war. King Aegon brought us peace. Now he offers us a share in our own governance. Some of us have misgivings. But I, Torrhen Stark, see in it a chance for the North to speak with our own voice." He paused, letting his words weigh on the air. "We will vote in favor." That announcement triggered a ripple of applause from some corners, dismay from others. Next, Lord Paramount Bryce Tully of the Riverlands stood. He was a short man, but broad-shouldered, with keen brown eyes. "The Riverlands have suffered in every war between the great houses. If this new assembly can avert such conflicts in the future, we welcome it." His voice trembled with passion. "I vote for it." A good number of Riverlords echoed him, nodding or calling out in approval. Then rose Lord Anders Lannister, whose line had famously bent the knee to Aegon after their defeat in the Field of Fire. He wore a red cloak trimmed with gold. "The Westerlands appreciate order. We also appreciate tradition," he said, his voice clipped. "Some in the West find this notion dangerous. Yet we have come to see that if we do not adapt, we risk being left behind. I vote in favor." Applause rose again, louder this time, interspersed with a few cheers from the common folk in the back. Hope flickered in Aegon's chest. But then Demon Valerion stood, the hall growing quieter. The Valerions were an ancient house, close kin to the Targaryens by blood and tradition, their seat at Driftmark. He spoke with measured calm. "Lord Lannister is correct that tradition matters. But does not the crown itself represent the greatest tradition of Westeros, the monarchy that unites us? He gestured around. If we yield too much power, what remains to hold the realm together? Will we not slip once more into chaos? The small folk deserve justice, certainly. But is granting them the right to choose laws, to perhaps overrule the wisdom of the lords, truly wise? Some murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Daemon pressed on, I love and respect King Aegon. My loyalty to House Targaryen is unwavering. But I question whether these ideas are feasible or safe. The Iron Islands will never accept the rule of a group of farmers from the Reach. Dorne has only recently bent the knee. Do we expect them to abide by laws set by Riverlanders they fought for so long? This system might tear itself apart. He paused, letting the words hang. Thus, with respect, I must voice my opposition. House Velaryon cannot support this measure. A smattering of applause answered him, but it was tempered by uncertainty. Aegon gazed at Daemon, remembering a younger iteration of the man who had once soared across Blackwater Bay on the back of a lesser dragon. They had been so close. How had Daemon become the standard-bearer for resistance? Was it only ambition, or did he truly fear chaos? One by one, the other regions declared their stance. Some were wholeheartedly in support, others on the fence, still others opposed. Dorne, represented by Lord Kyle Martell, was guardedly in favor, citing Aegon's gestures of respect and the desire to prevent further wars. The Vale's lords were deeply divided, as were the Storm Lords. The Ironborn delegates were among the fiercest opponents, with Lord Greyjoy dismissing the concept as weakening our freedom and subjugating us to an endless talkshop of fishmongers. The discussion stretched for hours as each region polled its lords and delegates. The scorching tension threatened to break the hall more than once. But Aegon allowed it, letting them vent, letting them weigh the possibilities. He knew that this was democracy's first test. Could it abide dissent without fracturing into violence? At last, the tall figure of Lord Corlys Byrch announced the final tally. In favor, the North, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, Dorne, half of the Crownlands, the other half were uncertain, a fraction of the Reach, the rest uncertain, and a smattering of lesser lords from across the realm. Opposed, most of the Iron Islands, a handful of staunch Vale lords, some in the Stormlands, and the rest of the Crownlands who stood behind Daemon Velaryon. Undecided or abstaining. A large swath of the Reach, the Vale, and the Stormlands. It was not a resounding victory, but neither was it a crushing defeat. Weighted by population, the measure had enough support to pass. If the abstaining lords could be brought on board, or at least not stand in the way. As the hall waited with bated breath, Lord Byrch turned to Aegon for the final word. The old king cleared his throat. We have a majority in principle, he said, voice echoing off the high stone walls. But it is precarious. Those who oppose, I hear your concerns. I will not sweep them aside with the threat of dragonfire. He paused, letting his words ring. I propose that we proceed with the creation of this assembly in the Crownlands, the North, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, and Dorne, those who are willing, and see how it functions in practice. In time, should the rest of you wish to join, you may. Or, if your fears prove justified, we shall address them. Better that we begin somewhere than nowhere at all. Some lords murmured in cautious agreement. Others remained stiff, but none gave voice to outright rebellion. Aegon's relief was immense, though he kept his face composed. Then he said, I name this day as the beginning of our great council. And with this I pray we sow the seeds of a new, more just realm. He lifted a hand. Let the gods and the people bear witness. A roar of applause and cheers erupted from the back of the hall, the small folk delegates, many of whom wept openly with joy. They embraced one another, some shouting thanks to the king. Among the lords, the reaction was more muted. Some clapped politely, others conferred in hushed tones. Lord Velaryon stood with folded arms, face unreadable. Still, no open protest emerged. Aegon allowed himself a small nod, turning from the podium. His cane trembled slightly in his grasp. He felt the swirl of heat and adrenaline in his body. He was an old man, but for this moment he felt the rush of youth. He had done it, or at least he had opened the door. Democracy would not blossom overnight, and many obstacles lay ahead, but the realm had taken the first step. Rhaegar was at his side. Your Grace, the youth said, eyes bright with excitement. You have won. They voted in favor, at least enough to begin. One might be too strong a word, Aegon said wryly, leaning on his cane. But we have begun indeed. In the days that followed, King's Landing buzzed with talk of the new assembly. Messengers galloped to the corners of the realm, bearing proclamations and clarifications. Craftsmen started building a new hall, a separate chamber near the Red Keep, intended to host the delegates. Overnight, it seemed, the city's taverns were full of conversation about who might stand for election, how the voting would be conducted, and whether the lords would truly listen to a blacksmith or a merchant. The old Targaryen sigil, three-headed dragon, still flew over the keep, but below it waved a new banner, a simple golden scale on a field of white, symbolizing justice and balance. Yet storms gathered as well. The faith militant, roused by rumors that the new measures favored freedom of worship as well as freedom of speech, began to preach that the king was straying from the seven-pointed star's path, leading men into the false idol of mortal pride. Lord Valerion hosted lavish feasts for uncertain Crownlands lords, hoping to stoke their fears of instability. Across the sea in Essos, certain merchant princes eyed Westeros with curiosity, pondering whether trade might flourish under a more representative system or whether chaos might open opportunities for exploitation. Amid these swirling currents, Aegon labored day and night, determined to craft the foundation of a lasting democracy. He chaired endless sessions with local scribes and knights, hammering out the exact language of the Assembly's charter. He insisted that each region that joined the council would choose a set number of delegates, at least a quarter of whom had to be commoners. That provision alone sparked fierce resistance from some corners. "No small folk shall stand equal to me in a chamber," one outraged lesser lord declared. But the king held firm, calling upon the support of those lords who had allied with him. Slowly, they cobbled together enough of a compromise to satisfy most. The assembly would open, and each region would be free to choose how its representatives were selected, so long as that quarter were common-born. Behind closed doors, Rhaegar worried about the danger to the king. The youth had stumbled across rumors of hired assassins sneaking into King's Landing. He confided in Lord Corley Spewire CH, who doubled the palace guard and quietly stationed loyal men near the assembly hall. Aegon waved off the threat, focusing on the tasks at hand, but at times Rhaegar would see a flicker of pain in the king's eyes. He was old. He had fought in a dozen battles, survived the Balerians' flight from Dragonstone to Harrenhal amid storms of arrows, but age was a more insidious enemy. Still, Aegon pushed on, summoning the same iron will that had once subdued Harren the Black. As the first official session of the Great Council approached, he called for a public festival. "Let the realm see that we embark on this with joy," he proclaimed. "No fear, no hush of secrecy. We are proud of our new path." Street performers and musicians filled the squares of King's Landing. Merchants set up stalls around every corner, hawking spiced wine and sweet pastries. Orators recited epic poems praising Aegon's vision. Painted banners fluttered from the city walls, many bearing the golden scale of the assembly. And so the day of the inaugural session arrived under bright, clear skies. They gathered in the newly built hall, still smelling of fresh timber. Seats formed a semicircle around a central dais. Banners of each participating region hung overhead, the wolf for the north, the lion for the Westerlands, the trout for the Riverlands, the sun and spear of Dorne, and the Targaryen dragon for the Crownlands. Aegon himself, leaning heavily on Rhaegar's arm, walked into the hall as a hush fell. He took a seat at the dais, alongside a table meant for scribes who would record the proceedings. The delegates, some in fine velvets and others in simple roughspun, eyed each other warily. This was a meeting like none Westeros had ever seen. A princess of House Martell sat beside a farmer from the Crownlands, both with votes of equal standing. Aegon rose, cane tapping the wooden floor. The hush deepened. "Good people of Westeros," he said, voice steady despite the lines of age on his face. "Welcome. This is your hall." He gestured around, letting his gaze pass over the unusual gathering. "For centuries, we have lived under the rule of kings, and that has brought us both triumphs and tragedies. Now, for the first time, we share that rule. Not just lords and ladies, but blacksmiths, merchants, masons, healers, and everyone who calls this land home. We stand united to govern ourselves wisely." An elder fisherman from Crackclaw Point stood, wringing his hat in his hands. "My king," he began, with a bow he could not quite stifle. I am Hob. I tend nets off the coast. I've never set foot in a hall such as this. I hardly know how to speak." He looked around with visible fear, as though expecting to be laughed at or thrown out. "But I pray that we can fix the fees that take half my catch and leave me with scarce enough to feed my family." From the high seats, a knight of the Crownlands barked, "Those fees maintain the roads you use to bring your fish to market, fisher." A mutter of discontent rippled through the smallfolk delegates. Aegon lifted a hand to still the tension. Let none dismiss another's concern. That is the very reason we are here. Let us debate the matter of the fishing fees. Let us find a compromise that serves the realm without crushing the livelihood of the people. He turned to the scribes. Make this the first item on the assembly's docket. So it began, the first real session of the Great Council. The delegates argued, conferred, negotiated. They haggled over fishing fees, the cost of grain shipments, the administration of local justice. Some lords bristled at being spoken to as equals by those they deemed lesser, yet the presence of the king, so firmly supportive of the assembly's structure, restrained them. In the end, the Great Council hammered out a small but symbolic reform on fishing fees, reducing them to a more reasonable rate while reserving a fraction for road maintenance. Hob the fisherman, trembling with relief and pride, publicly thanked the assembly. Word of that success spread through the city. The small folk marveled at the new era dawning. Many lords quietly fumed, predicting chaos. But chaos did not come, at least not immediately. The subsequent sessions of the council tackled more issues, from the distribution of harvest surpluses to the building of new holdfasts on the Dornish marches. Some measures passed narrowly, others failed outright. But each time, the assembly reconvened, adjusting proposals, forging compromises. The people began to realize they could shape these laws. Letters from the far corners of the participating regions poured in, carrying petitions, pleas, and advice. This was an entirely new way of governing, messy but brimming with possibility. Yet as the weeks wore on, resistance hardened. The Iron Islands openly declared they would have no part in this weak southern experiment. They closed their ports to crown ships, capturing a few merchant vessels to show their defiance. One or two stormlords joined with them in protest, claiming the king had betrayed the old ways. The faith militant grew bolder, condemning the Great Council as an affront to the authority of the Seven. Ser Jonathan Caron of the Stormlands went so far as to brand the new delegates false prophets, leading men away from the natural order the gods decreed. These strains came to a head one night in a hidden courtyard off the Street of Steel, where a small group of robed figures plotted by torchlight. They were conspirators, sworn to restore the old ways. Some wore the seven-pointed star pinned to their chests. Others wore house sigils of lords who had publicly pledged to remain neutral. Their voices buzzed with anger. "We must remove the king," one whispered. "So long as Aegon Targaryen lives, the Great Council has authority. If he dies, the realm will revert to the old ways. And who can blame us if an old man's heart gives out in the night? We must be cautious," another warned. "There are the Kingsguard." But the robed figure who spoke first scoffed. "One well-placed knife, a bit of poison. The realm will be grateful that we spared it from this folly." They parted, each sworn to secrecy. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks. An urchin sleeping under a nearby stairwell heard part of their hushed conversation. Whether the conspirators never noticed him or thought him inconsequential is unknown, but the boy made for the Red Keep, slipping past board guards to reach Rhaegar Waters's chambers. Shaking with fear and excitement, he blurted out what he had overheard. Rhaegar, stricken, demanded details. The boy had little more, but it was enough to confirm that an assassination plot was afoot. Rhaegar rushed to the king's private rooms, where he found Aegon alone at a small desk, poring over letters from the north. His silvered hair caught the lamplight, shadows accentuating the deep lines on his face. "Your Grace," Rhaegar gasped, "there's a plot against your life. Someone means to strike soon." Aegon set down his quill, blinking. "Come yourself, lad. Have a seat. Tell me everything." His composure was unnerving, as though he had expected this. Rhaegar relayed the boy's testimony, how the conspirators had spoken of poison and a single knife. Aegon nodded thoughtfully, fingers steepled. When Rhaegar finished, the king sighed. "I have lived with threats since the day I first claimed Balerion, but I will not hide away. The realm must see that I stand firm. To cower now would only embolden them. We must at least increase your guard," Rhaegar insisted. "Double, triple, and let's root out these conspirators." Aegon's gaze shifted to the open window where the moonlight spilled onto the stones. "Find them, yes, but with proof. I don't want to purge on mere rumor. We must show we deal in justice, not fear. Quietly have Lord Byrch deploy men to investigate. If these traitors can be identified, we'll put them on trial in open court." Rhaegar bowed his head. "As you say, your grace." But he could not hide his worry. The king, for all his will, was still old, still mortal. A single slip could end everything they had worked for. Over the following days, the Great Council continued its sessions, but a pall of dread loomed. The king's hand worked in secret, investigating the conspiracy. Lord Birch eventually turned up a handful of suspicious courtiers, 2 septons who had strong ties to the faith militant, and a minor Stormlands lord with a record of sending encrypted letters. Under subtle interrogation, one of the septons cracked and revealed the names of others involved. Warrants were quietly prepared. At the next session of the council, the arrests were made without fanfare. Ser Miles, commander of the King's Guard, escorted the culprits from the hall, each swearing innocence or cursing the crown. Aegon immediately ordered a public trial to show that even traitors were entitled to justice. The day of the trial, the great hall was filled to bursting. The conspirators were marched in, wrists bound. Evidence was presented, letters discussing poisons, witness accounts, coded messages tying them to unholy machinations. Some lords in the crowd glowered, worried that they would be implicated next. The smallfolk delegates watched in fascination and fear. Finally, after hours of testimony, the assembled lords and delegates, the Great Council, voted on guilt or innocence. The verdict was unanimous, guilty. A hush fell as the king rose from the Iron Throne to pronounce sentence. The conspirators fell to their knees, pleading mercy, weeping, cursing. One shrieked that the Great Council was an abomination. Another spat at the floor, vowing that the faith militant would avenge them. Aegon listened, face stern. "You have broken the realm's peace by plotting to murder the king and subvert the will of the people," he said. "The penalty in times past would be death by dragonfire. But we have new ways now. You shall be imprisoned, your lands and titles forfeit. Let the realm see that justice is not cruelty. May the Seven have mercy on your souls." The small folk delegates exhaled in relief. Some had feared a grim spectacle of burning or beheading. Instead, the conspirators would rot in cells, stripped of power, their cause disgraced. A quiet sense of triumph pulsed through the city that night. The Great Council had functioned. It had faced down a conspiracy without resorting to brutality. Rumors spread that the conspirators had once hoped to recruit Demon Valerion, but he had refused them. Whether he had refused out of loyalty or calculation, none could say, but either way he had distanced himself. Perhaps he realized that the realm was changing around him and an open coup would never succeed. As the weeks turned into months, the new assembly continued its work. It hammered out a law guaranteeing certain protections for peasants, limiting arbitrary taxes, and investing in roads and communal granaries. Dorne proposed an initiative to welcome more cross-regional trade fairs, which the North supported in exchange for Southern cooperation on winter relief. The lords learned, begrudgingly, how to make alliances with commoner delegates to pass measures they favored. The commoners, in turn, discovered that compromise was necessary, that not every dream of equality could be rushed through in a single stroke. Gradually, a web of alliances, deals, and personal relationships formed within the assembly. A blacksmith's son from Lannisport became friends with a minor noblewoman from Sunspear, united by a shared interest in maritime trade. A septon from the Crownlands, who had once eyed the assembly with suspicion, found himself championing better roads to bring more worshippers to his September. Each small success added mortar to the foundation, and presiding over it all, guiding it with a patient hand, was King Aegon Targaryen, the conqueror turned innovator. He rarely sat upon the Iron Throne anymore, preferring a seat amidst the assembly's dais. He would speak last, letting the debate flow freely. He urged them to find consensus, to respect each other's dignity. Sometimes the lords who opposed him most fiercely mocked him for his idealism. But he had faced worse than their laughter. He had faced open war and survived. Whenever a crisis threatened, like the Iron Islands blocking trade routes, or a stormlord threatening to withdraw from the assembly, Aegon used his old authority as conqueror to quell the danger. He sent the royal fleet to guard merchant ships or personally flew on Balerion, the Black Dread, now slow in flight but still terrifying in silhouette, to parley with rebellious lords. The message was clear: the monarchy still lived, still had teeth. But it wielded that power in defense of the assembly, not in suppression of it. Still, new concerns arose. Some whispered that if the monarchy was now only the defender of the assembly's will, then the Targaryens would eventually be dethroned in all but name. Others insisted that the monarchy could yet seize back power and subvert the assembly. The tension was real and it became a frequent topic of debate within the assembly itself. One day, it bubbled to the surface with delegates questioning the king directly. Will House Targaryen accept any vote, even one that might curtail the crown's prerogatives further? A hush fell, the entire chamber leaning forward for the king's response. Aegon rose slowly, leaning on his cane. If the realm decides to limit the crown's authority in pursuit of justice, he said, his voice grave, then so be it. A king who does not serve his people is no king at all. Shockwaves rippled through the assembly. That was the day many realized this was not some half-hearted experiment. Aegon truly believed in a new order. And so the months turned to a year and then two. The Great Council matured, hammered by storms but still standing. More regions tentatively joined. The Vale, after much internal debate, voted to participate. The Stormlands came in piecemeal, lord by lord. Only the Iron Islands remained wholly outside, a realm apart. And while tensions still flared, no full-scale civil war erupted. As time wore on, the realm seemed more peaceful than it had been in generations. For small folk, that peace meant more stable crops, fewer random exactions, and some measure of hope that their voices mattered. For many lords, it meant forging alliances in the assembly that could be more lucrative and less destructive than war. For some old warriors, it was a source of lament. We have grown fat and complacent in this new era, they muttered. But for the majority, the benefits were apparent. In the second year of the assembly, Aegon's health worsened. Rhaegar frequently found the king awake at night, coughing into a cloth. He began to limp more heavily, and sometimes his hands trembled so violently that he could scarcely sign a decree. Maesters came and went, prescribing tonics and bed rest. But Aegon refused to step away from the council. He was determined to see it firmly entrenched before he left this world. One afternoon, in the newly minted Assembly Hall, he collapsed during a heated debate over a measure to fund new libraries in Old Town and Winterfell. Panicked delegates rushed forward, but Rhaegar and Lord Byrch carried the king to a side chamber. The maesters arrived swiftly, administering potions and urging quiet. Aegon awakened, groggy, to find Rhaegar kneeling at his bedside. "You collapsed, your grace," the young squire whispered, tears brimming in his eyes. "We thought we'd lost you." Aegon managed a faint smile, lifting a trembling hand to Rhaegar's cheek. "Not yet, lad," he rasped. "There is still work to be done." Rhaegar gripped his hand, tears falling. The king's gaze roamed as though searching for something unseen. "You asked me once how I find my courage," Aegon whispered. "I find it in men like you, in those who believe, who will carry this torch forward when I am gone." Rhaegar bowed his head. "Then I shall do all I can, my king. I swear it." Days later, Aegon insisted on returning to the council. Maesters and friends begged him to rest, to let the assembly run itself, but he refused. "They need to see me, to know I haven't abandoned them." With Rhaegar and a few guards by his side, he hobbled back into the hall, stopping frequently to catch his breath. The delegates rose as one, a hush of awe at the sight of their king, frail yet unbroken. He took his seat. The debate resumed, more subdued. When asked for his opinion on a matter of library funding, Aegon coughed, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Let knowledge guide us, for knowledge is the root of wisdom. Approve the measure." The delegates nodded, quickly passing it by overwhelming support. None wished to oppose the king in such a moment, and besides, many believed in the cause. That night, Rhaegar sat with Aegon in his bedchamber. The old king gazed out the window at a city transformed. New avenues lit by lamps, throngs of people free to gather and speak, a sense of possibility in the air. "We have changed the realm," he said, voice heavy with fatigue. "Not all will embrace it, but enough will. When I first came to Westeros, I never imagined such a thing. You have done more than unify it by conquest, your grace," Rhaegar said. "You have given it a voice." Aegon slowly nodded. "When the day comes that I pass from this world, tell them all, lords, small folk, all, that I have faith in them. The Targaryens are not the realm. The realm is all of us." He paused, breath-catching. "I have regrets for the blood I spilled so many years ago. But if I have left the realm better than I found it, perhaps the gods will forgive me." Rhaegar bowed his head. "They will." Not long after, in the quiet hours before dawn, King Aegon the Conqueror died in his sleep. The news spread through the Red Keep, stunning everyone. At first, there was panic. Would the Great Council collapse now that the man who championed it was gone? But then the delegates summoned themselves, the small folk representatives joining with the lords, and together they drafted a decree: the assembly would remain. The monarchy would pass to Aegon's chosen heir, his great-grandson Maelon Targaryen, but the assembly would continue as a permanent institution. The first test of the new democracy had arrived. Would a new king accept this arrangement? At the funeral, thousands gathered. From the lowliest beggars to the mightiest lords, they lined the streets as Aegon's funeral barge drifted down the Blackwater. The silent throng parted like waves. Torches flickered in the dusk. In a final nod to tradition, Balerion, nearly blind and no longer able to fly far, was led onto a barge to accompany his master on the last voyage. It was said the old dragon breathed one final gout of flame to light Aegon's funeral pyre on the water, then collapsed on the deck, never to stir again. The people wept, lords and peasants alike, for the passing of an era. Young King Maelon Targaryen, though untested, stood before the Great Council the following day. The delegates watched with bated breath. Many feared he would renounce their authority, that Aegon's dream would die with him. Maelon was a slender youth of 20, with solemn violet eyes. He knelt before the dais, where the assembly was convened, then rose and said, "My great-grandfather believed in you. I will not betray that faith. The monarchy stands, but so does the assembly." A wave of relief and applause washed through the hall, and so Aegon's vision took root. Over time, the Great Council evolved into a permanent parliament, representing both nobles and commoners. Successive kings navigated the delicate balance between crown and council, sometimes leaning one way, sometimes the other, but never wholly overturning the system. The small folk gradually learned how to make their voices heard, forging alliances with sympathetic lords, protesting injustices, celebrating victories. Though conflicts still arose, ambition, greed, and pride did not vanish overnight. There was now a framework to address them without resorting so quickly to open war. Generations passed, and historians wrote of Aegon's transformation from conqueror to founder of the Westerosi Parliament. Children learned of his final years as a time of forging a new realm, not with dragonfire but with dialogue and compromise. The statue of Aegon atop the hill of Visenya, once depicted in battle armor astride Balerion, was replaced by a new monument commissioned by King Maelon. It showed Aegon standing in simple robes, reaching out a hand to a farmer. At first, many lords decried it as an insult to Targaryen might. But as the realm stabilized and prospered under the new system, the statue became a beloved symbol, reminding all that the realm's true strength lay in the union of its people. And in the city squares, in the villages, in the halls of power, the name of Aegon the Conqueror took on new meaning. Yes, he had conquered, but that was only the beginning. In the end, he had conquered not merely armies, but doubt and tradition itself, building a democracy that, while never perfect, gave Westeros a chance at a future shaped by the voices of many, not just the will of one. His memory lingered in the knowledge that sometimes even the most fearsome dragon lord could discover a kinder way to rule and leave behind a realm better than he found it. The Great Council convened 2 days after King Aegon's funeral in an atmosphere thick with sorrow and speculation. The marble floors of the assembly hall were still adorned with wilted wreaths of black roses, tokens of the realm's grief for the conqueror-turned-reformer. A hush lay over the crowd of delegates and onlookers, lords and peasants alike, as if everyone feared that the dream might die now that its foremost champion was gone. Word had already spread of King Maelon's vow that he would uphold his great-grandfather's legacy. But good intentions and an actual reign were two different beasts, and the future of the assembly teetered in uncertainty. Maelon Targaryen entered the hall through the great double doors, flanked by the Kingsguard, his footfalls echoing. He was a slender youth of 20, dressed simply in black cloth trimmed with silver thread. Those with a keen eye for Targaryen history noted he wore none of the dragon-themed finery that had once marked his ancestors in the heyday of conquest. No dragon-shaped cloak pins, no golden crown with rubies shaped like roaring drakes, only a modest silver circlet across his brow. When he came to the dais, he paused, gaze drifting over the assembled delegates. In the front rows were noble lords and ladies. Torrhen Stark from the north, Anders Lannister from the Westerlands, Bryce Tully representing the Riverlands, Meredith Hightower and her allies from the Reach, and Kyle Martell from Dorne. Beside them were the lesser but still highborn houses who had joined the assembly: Rosby, Celtigar, Massey, Valerian, Stokeworth, Sunglass, BYRCH, and a host of others. Behind these, in simpler garments, sat the commoner delegates, the farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who had begun to find their voices in the last 2 years. The only bright color in the somber assembly was the newly woven banner that hung behind the dais. It bore both the dragon of House Targaryen and the golden balance scales, emblem of the fledgling parliament, two symbols side by side, neither overshadowing the other. It was King Aegon's final bequest, designed just before his death and delivered to the hall on the morning of Maelon's coronation. Now it billowed gently on an unseen current of air, a silent reminder of the partnership that had been forged between throne and people. Maelon inclined his head and spoke in a resonant voice that belied his thin frame. Lords, ladies, delegates, and all who have come today, I thank you for gathering in this time of grief and transition. My great-grandfather believed that Westeros could govern itself more justly with this great council. He believed that the monarchy should serve the realm, not the other way around. I stand before you to declare that I hold to his vision. Long live the assembly, and may it guide us toward a brighter future. An initial response of applause rippled through the hall. It was neither thunderous nor meager, but the measured clapping of those uncertain whether they should commit fully to hope. Maelon glanced at Lord Corlys BYRCH, the king's hand, who stood nearby, then at Rhaegar Waters, Aegon's former squire who had served as an informal protector and aide. Rhaegar had tears in his eyes, though he tried to remain composed. Every face here still bore the mark of Aegon's passing. I know, Maelon continued, raising a hand for silence, that some of you question my resolve. I am young. I have never tested my might in battle. But let me assure you, my lords, ladies, and people, that I do not take this lightly. My great-grandfather overcame his own doubts when he chose to share power. If I must face threats to keep this system alive, I shall. This great council is a living thing. It thrives only if we feed it with good faith. If we starve it through treachery, through apathy, then it will wither, and the realm will return to the old ways of war and oppression. I for one do not wish that. He paused, letting his gaze roam. Today, I affirm in front of you all that I will not revoke a single law or tradition that the Great Council has thus far established. Now there was a stronger applause, and from the back, a fisherman let out a cheer that sounded like the squawk of a gull. It drew a few smiles, briefly lightening the tension. Maelon placed his hand on the table in front of him, where the scribes had set out a thick ledger containing the assembly's records. We have matters of state to discuss, he said softly, and they cannot wait for our mourning to end. My great-grandfather did not pause the realm when his sisters died. He pressed on to do what needed doing. So will we. With that, Lord Torrhen Stark stood. He was older now, his beard thick with silver strands, his eyes as cold and calm as the winter snows. Your Grace, he began, voice carefully even, the North continues to abide by the Assembly's guidance and we reaffirm our membership. But as ever, the North is both geographically and culturally distant from much of the realm. Our roads remain in dire condition, especially with winter drawing near. We ask that the Great Council fulfill its promise of sending funds for the improvement of roads. We also ask for a guarantee of assistance should the free folk beyond the wall begin raiding again this season. Maelon nodded. Roads and raiders, he said. These are indeed pressing concerns. I propose the Assembly form a commission to ascertain the cost of improvements in the North. Then we will examine the treasury to see if At that, a sharp voice cut through. The realm's treasury is not an endless purse, Your Grace. It belonged to Lady Valina Florent of the Reach, a staunch opponent of frivolous spending, as she liked to call it. Her features were hawkish, and she wore a burgundy gown embellished with the fiery heart of her own house's banner. We already fund roads in the Crownlands, the Riverlands, and the Westerlands. The Reach alone provides nearly a quarter of the tax revenue, and we have many demands of our own. Unless the North can show how these roads will directly benefit the entire realm, I question if we should pay for them. A low rumble of discontent spread among the northern delegates. Maelon's eyes flickered, not with anger, but with a calm consideration. Lady Florent, with better roads, trade flows more freely, not just to benefit the North, but all who supply goods to them. If the route between Winterfell and the southern regions is impassable, it curtails commerce in every region that might sell produce, livestock, cloth, or metalwork to the North. In simpler terms, if your roads end at Moat Caelin's muddy path, you lose a customer. Am I right? A few heads nodded in agreement, impressed by the clarity of the young king's argument. Lady Florent frowned. Still, we must be certain the costs do not exceed the likely profit, or that the funds could not be more effectively used elsewhere, like in the Westerlands, where certain key passes need reinforcing. Lord Anders Lannister gave a polite cough. We do indeed have concerns. Pirates near Lannisport, roving brigands in the Gold Road passes. We can't pretend resources are infinite. Malon let his gaze move over them all. It seems we have multiple requests for infrastructure improvements. Let us do what my great-grandfather would do, refer this to the full assembly for discussion, form committees if needed, and weigh the cost against the realm's overall wealth and priorities. We will act on each region's concerns fairly. And so began the session, a debate both raucous and measured, alternating between lofty ideals and petty barbs. Malon observed carefully, intervening only when tempers flared too high or misunderstandings threatened to derail the discussion. The assembly argued over distribution of funds for roads, proposed laws on fair trade practices, and potential responses to renewed Ironborn raids. The Iron Islands still clung to their independence outside the assembly, continuing their old ways of reaving. Since Aegon's death, rumors had multiplied that House Greyjoy was testing the new king's resolve. Many ships had been seized in the waters west of the Arbor, and a few lords began calling for an armed response. Kyle Martell stood to address the matter of the Ironborn. His dark eyes narrowed in distaste. "The reaving cannot be allowed to continue without censure," he said. "We all know the Iron Islands refused to join the assembly. They mock us at every turn. They see these sessions as weakness while we dither and talk. Meanwhile, they strike. I suggest a show of force, a blockade of pike, and the capture of any raiders found upon the seas." A short but wiry fisherman from the Crownlands, one Hob the Nets, known to many for his cameo in the Assembly's earliest sessions, rose tremblingly. "My lord, blockade them if you must, but remember that not all Ironborn are reavers. Some live peacefully trading saltfish. There are families on those islands who just want to survive. Would we starve them all to punish the wicked? So what do you propose?" Fisherman growled, a broad Stormlander with a jagged scar on his face. "We let them sail in, burn our ships, and take thralls without consequence?" "That's not what I said," Hob muttered, twisting his cap. "But if the king and the assembly can find a way to strike the reavers, not the innocent." The Stormlander snorted. "The so-called innocent on the Iron Islands vote for those captains who reave. They abide the old way because it suits them. I say root them out." Amid the rising din, Malon raised his hand. "We all agree something must be done. Let us consider proposals. If blockade is too blunt, perhaps we can target known pirate dens or arm certain convoys for mutual defense, ensuring safe passage. The point is, the monarchy no longer unilaterally wages war, but the monarchy can still lead the realm in protecting our seas if the assembly consents." For a moment, a hush lingered in the hall. Some delegates exchanged glances, uncertain whether to press for immediate war or to trust in a more measured approach. Ultimately, they decided to refer the issue to a smaller committee with delegates from coastal regions, those most affected by the raids. They would hammer out a plan for the next full session. And so the day wore on. Despite the friction, the assembly continued to function, forging precarious compromises, deferring intractable problems for future sessions, and enacting smaller measures swiftly. Some proposals soared or sank on the strength of a single speech. Others withered in subcommittees, never to be seen again. All the while, Malon presided with a solemn courtesy that impressed even skeptics. The young king did not have the iron presence of Aegon the Conqueror, but he possessed a patient determination that might, in time, earn him a unique kind of respect. When the session finally adjourned, the delegates began to filter out into the corridors of the assembly hall. Dusk had fallen, and the torches that lined the walls flickered with dancing light. The crowd spilled into the courtyard where Rhaegar Waters waited at Malon's side. Rhaegar had become a kind of counselor to the new king, though he held no official title. His presence reassured many who had grown to trust him during Aegon's final years. "You did well, Your Grace," Rhaegar said softly as Malon rubbed his temples. "You kept them on task, prevented any outbursts from boiling over. You commanded respect." Malon exhaled, his breath fogging in the chill of the evening. "It's exhausting. I've studied how my great-grandfather did it, listening, guiding, balancing, but living it is something else. I worry that if I slip for even a moment, everything might fracture." "You're not alone," Rhaegar assured him. "Lord Corlys stands with you, as does most of the Crownlands. The smallfolk delegates still revere your family's memory of the Conqueror who gave them a voice. And many lords are starting to see the benefits: fewer internal wars, more stable trade. You have more allies than you think." The king's violet eyes flickered with gratitude. Then he spotted Lady Meredith Hightower at the courtyard's edge, talking to Kyle Martell in hushed tones. She glanced at Maelon, offering a respectful nod before continuing her conversation. The two parted ways, each heading off with their respective entourages. King Maelon wondered what alliance might be brewing there, for the lords and ladies had learned to forge pacts across region and station to pass the measures they favored. This was no longer only about who sat the Iron Throne. It was also about who controlled the balance in the assembly. Maelon recognized that the monarchy's unique role was to stand above such factionalism. If he plunged too blatantly into politicking, he might lose moral authority. Yet if he stood aloof, some faction might seize enough power to unmake the entire experiment. He was still musing on these dilemmas when a lean man in simple gray robes emerged from the shadows. It was Septon Elisar, a noted moderate within the faith who had grown sympathetic to the reforms once he saw how the Great Council could address poverty and crime. With a low bow, the Septon said, "Your Grace, I wonder if I might speak with you privately regarding matters of the faith. I've heard troubling rumors of zealots plotting within the city. They claim the new king is too young, that he's a puppet of the assembly, and that the assembly itself is sacrilege." Rhaegar tensed, remembering the conspiracy against Aegon that they had rooted out 2 years prior. Maelon nodded. "Come. We'll speak in the solar." He gestured for a few Kingsguard to follow. The group made its way through torchlit corridors to a modest solar on the second floor of the assembly hall, a room set aside for private conferences. The flicker of candlelight revealed tapestries depicting the founding of King's Landing and the signing of the assembly's charter. Maelon took a seat at the head of a long table, inviting the Septon to sit. Rhaegar stood behind the king's chair, watchful. Septon Elisar lowered himself onto the bench, adjusting the folds of his robe. "Your Grace," he began, voice hushed. "I have heard talk among certain militant members of the faith, akin to those who once rose up in the time of Maegor the Cruel. They say the monarchy, by yielding to the will of commoners and lords alike, has insulted the authority of the Seven. They claim only a divinely anointed king should rule, answerable to the gods through the High Septon, and that this new arrangement exalts mortal pride. I fear they may plan demonstrations or even violence." Maelon laced his fingers. A familiar refrain. "My great-grandfather faced it. So did the assembly. What do you suggest we do?" "Speak with the High Septon," Elisar replied. "He is not one of the zealots. He tries to maintain neutrality, but these radicals exploit the faith's name. If the High Septon were to endorse the Great Council publicly, condemning violence, it might rob these would-be fanatics of any claim to legitimacy. At the very least, it would force them to reveal themselves more openly." Rhaegar interjected carefully, "Does the High Septon truly stand aside from these radicals? Or is he quietly encouraging them?" Elisar shook his head. "I believe he stands aside. He may resent certain changes, like the new laws that limit the faith's right to collect certain tithes. But he has no taste for bloodshed. He is old and cautious. He might be swayed to condemn the radicals if approached with respect." Maelon mulled this over. "I will request an audience with him then, though I suspect persuading him will not be simple. The faith never relishes losing influence." Elisar gave a wan smile. "Nothing about your reign will be simple, Your Grace." When the Septon had departed, Rhaegar leaned close to Maelon. "We should prepare for the worst. Even if the High Septon denounces them, these radicals may not relent. The old faith militant might rise again. If that happens, we could have rebellion on our hands." Maelon nodded, grave. "I'll speak with Lord Byrch about reinforcing the city watch. But gently, I don't wish to give the impression we're installing a garrison against the faith. Fear can create the crisis we're trying to avoid." Rhaegar inclined his head, though worry lingered in his expression. The memory of caring for an ailing Aegon while conspirators crept through the shadows was still fresh. He would not let history repeat if he could help it. The weeks that followed were a tapestry of challenge and promise, with the new king occupying a precarious center of gravity. Maelon spent hours conferring with the Great Council's committees on the Ironborn raids, on road improvements in the north, on trade expansions in Dorne, and on a new measure to standardize coinage. He also met privately with the High Septon, traveling in modest procession to the Great September of Baelor, where he knelt in prayer before the gilded altars. The High Septon, a wizened man with rheumy eyes, listened to the young king's entreaties politely, though he agreed only to issue a vague statement decrying needless violence and urging the faithful to live in peace. Whether that would be enough to calm the zealots remained to be seen. In the meantime, letters poured in from far reaches of Westeros. The Vale, which had belatedly joined the assembly only under Aegon's final years, now petitioned for official seats on the committees shaping new laws. Maelon gladly granted them their portion, earning goodwill from the Arryns and their banner houses. The Storm Lords, historically fractious, sent conflicting messages. Some had embraced the assembly's potential for peace and trade, others were caught up in the swirl of militant faith dogma, claiming the assembly was an affront to the Seven. The Reach, ever prosperous, threatened to withhold a portion of its tax revenues if the assembly did not address the pressing matter of farmland disputes along the Mander. Each day, Rhaegar watched the young king methodically sift through letters, delegating tasks to scribes, advisors, and delegates. Maelon, though weary, never faltered in his willingness to read and respond. It was a new style of kingly labor, not just edicts from on high, but correspondence with the realm's many voices. One evening, after a grueling day of council debates, Maelon retired to his private solar in the Red Keep. The newly constructed assembly hall lay just to the north, connected by a corridor, but the king still maintained apartments in the keep for tradition's sake and for security. He sank into a carved wooden chair by the hearth, letting out a soft groan of exhaustion. Rhaegar stood by the mantel, watching the flames cast flickers of orange across the stone floor. "You're working yourself raw, Your Grace," Rhaegar ventured quietly. "Even your great-grandfather took occasional breaks. He used to say that a mind cannot stay sharp without rest." Maelon closed his eyes briefly. "Sometimes I wonder if I should, but there's so much to do. The realm is like a spinning wheel with 1,000 spokes. If I'm not careful, everything might come tumbling apart. I can't let that happen." Rhaegar fetched a cup of cooled wine and handed it to the king. "Your Grace, you cannot fix it all in a single day, or a single week, or even a single year. The assembly is meant to share the burden. Trust them to do their part." Sipping the wine, Maelon gazed into the fire. He was silent for a long moment before speaking in a softer voice. "I do trust them, but I also know how many lords are suspicious of a monarchy that's no longer absolute. They watch me, waiting for me to revert to the old ways or betray the assembly's cause. Meanwhile, the commoner delegates watch me, too, afraid I might let the lords strip away their new rights. Everyone is wary. If I show the slightest weakness, they'll think the worst. So I press on." Rhaegar placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You stand on the shoulders of Aegon's achievements, and so far, you've done right by them. You're forging your own path now. The realm can see you're sincere." A ghost of a smile touched Maelon's lips. "Thank you, Rhaegar. You've always been a steady presence. My great-grandfather trusted you. So do I." They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling. Outside, King's Landing murmured with the activity of thousands. Torches glimmered along the city walls, and a faint breeze from Blackwater Bay whispered through the open window. Somewhere in the distance, a watchman blew his horn thrice to signal the changing of the guard. Finally, Maelon rose. "I'll sleep now. Tomorrow is another assembly day. Will you walk with me in the morning?" Rhaegar nodded. "Of course, Your Grace." In the weeks that followed, the tension with the faith militant zealots simmered. Their pamphlets, scrawled with fiery rhetoric, appeared in alleyways and on sept doors, denouncing the abomination of mortal rule without divine sanction. Yet no open attacks occurred, perhaps because the city watch, newly reinforced, patrolled the streets vigilantly. The High Septon's mild statement against violence may have tempered the fervor of some moderate faithful. Nevertheless, the threat lingered, as rumors persisted of secret gatherings in abandoned buildings near the Dragon Pit ruins. Some whispered that a new Hand of the Seven had been anointed in secret, poised to lead a purge of the assembly, just as had happened under Maegor Targaryen centuries ago. Meanwhile, the question of the Iron Islands demanded resolution. The committee assigned to address it met daily in a small chamber within the assembly hall. It included delegates from the Westerlands, the Reach, Dorne, the Riverlands, and the Crownlands, especially those with maritime interests. Sometimes the debate boiled over into angry shouting, with the Dornish delegates calling for a blockade, the Westerlanders advocating armed escorts for shipping, and the Crownlander fishermen like Hobb urging caution. Lord Daemon Valerion, once a skeptic of the assembly, had returned to the capital with cautious acceptance of the new order. As master of ships, he chaired these meetings. He presented reports of ironborn raids, missing vessels, and sightings of longships near the coast of the Reach. Yet he seemed ambivalent about launching a full-scale conflict. He had lived long enough to see how war could shred the realm's fragile unity. On a crisp morning, King Maelon attended one of these committee sessions in person, taking a seat at the circular table. Lord Demon Valerian bowed courteously. Your Grace, we are just discussing the cost and feasibility of blockading Pike. A frowning, bronze-skinned delegate from Dorne, Lady Norella Euler, locked eyes with the king. The Ironborn only understand strength, she declared. They must learn that if they will not join the assembly, we will not tolerate their raids. If we blockade them for even a few moons, starve out the Reavers, perhaps they will come to the negotiating table. Hob the Nets shook his head, hands trembling slightly as he laid a parchment on the table. And starve innocents as well. Not everyone on the Iron Islands is a raider. We have trade partners there, humble fisherfolk, who rely on shipments of grain from the mainland. Should we condemn them to die because of their lord's cruelty? Lady Norella's expression hardened. Cruelty? We're dealing with people who abduct men and women to be thralls. Is that not cruelty enough? A blockade is more merciful than burning them out. Rhaegar, standing beside Maelon, stepped in. What if we tailor a narrower strategy? We could launch a campaign against only the known strongholds of Reavers, the Greyjoys at Pike, the Harlaws on Harlaw, the Blacktides on Blacktide. Meanwhile, we allow shipments of food to smaller ports if they vow not to harbor raiders. Let them sign a pledge or a treaty, which the Assembly can enforce by sending inspectors. A flicker of interest crossed Lord Valerian's face. Sending inspectors will require ships, men, resources, but it might be a middle path between total blockade and total inaction. Lady Norella nodded grudgingly. It seems complicated, but perhaps less destructive. Hob exhaled in relief. I would support that approach, especially if we ensure those inspectors protect innocents. King Maelon cleared his throat. Let us work out the details, which ports would be allowed to receive shipments, under what conditions, and how we enforce them. We must be sure House Greyjoy cannot exploit any loophole. If they openly declare hostility, we will respond with force. But if smaller Ironborn lords show willingness to parley, we should not push them into Greyjoy's arms. Understood. The committee agreed to draft a four-mal proposal. Lord Valerian offered to direct the Crown's fleet to support the plan, though he insisted on the Assembly's formal endorsement so no one could call it a royal war waged without consultation. Maelon admired the subtle shift in Valerian's stance. Once, the man might have resented the Assembly's interference, but now he was using it to legitimize Crown action. The monarchy and the Assembly were learning to work in tandem. By midday, the committee had hammered out a rudimentary plan, pending a full vote in the Great Council. Delegates filtered out to share the news. Some seemed satisfied, others wary. Maelon was heartened. At least they were acting. No doubt the Greyjoys would test their resolve, but the realm was no longer frozen in indecision. On leaving the committee chamber, Maelon paused in the corridor, glancing at a large stained-glass window that depicted King Aegon handing a charter to a group of peasants. It was a stylized, idealized portrait, but it stirred the king's heart. Sometimes he felt the old Conqueror's presence guiding his steps, reminding him that each compromise, each argument, was part of a grander design. A realm truly governed by its people and their king together. He reached out, his fingertips pressing lightly to the glass. In the reflection, he spotted Rhaegar's silhouette behind him. If only he could see this, Maelon murmured. To know that his dream endures. Rhaegar stepped forward. I think he does see, in some way. Perhaps he rests in peace, seeing that Westeros has not crumbled without his hand. Maelon sighed. I pray you are right. He let his hand drop. We've more to do this afternoon. The debate on standardizing coinage starts soon. Will you stand with me? Always, Rhaegar said. Together, they walked toward the main assembly chamber, where the lords, ladies, and common delegates were already gathering in a rising clamor. The next few hours were devoted to a topic that seemed mundane yet was crucial to the realm's stability, merging the various regional currencies into a single mint under the crown's oversight. Some lords objected, fearing it would diminish their local authority over coin. Others championed it, believing it would simplify trade and reduce corruption. The debate raged, with Maelon presiding from a seat behind the dais, letting delegates speak in turn. By the end, a compromise was reached. The crown would produce a single standard coin, minted in King's Landing, but each region could continue striking commemorative coinage for ceremonial use, provided it matched the gold or silver content of the realm's coin. It was not the sweeping unification some wanted, but it moved the realm a step closer to a coherent economy. After the meeting, Maelon lingered to speak with a young blacksmith who served as a representative for the Crownland's commoners. The blacksmith's name was John Pate, a quiet man with thick arms from his forge work. He approached the king shyly, removing a leather cap. "Your Grace," he said, "I just wanted to thank you for hearing my concerns. Standard coinage may seem small to some, but for men like me who have to haggle with different coin weights, it's a blessing." Maelon clasped the man's rough hand. "Thank you for speaking. The assembly only works if people like you share your experiences. Don't ever doubt your voice matters." John Pate bowed, tears brimming in his eyes at the unusual spectacle of a king who listened. Maelon's chest ached with a mixture of pride and humility. Perhaps, he thought, this was the realm Aegon had hoped to see, a place where men of different standings could meet in some measure of equality, forging laws that served the common good. Yes, it was still fragile. And yes, enemies lurked. But it lived. That night, King Maelon hosted a modest banquet in the Red Keep for key figures in the realm, both lords and commoners of some standing in the assembly. He had decided that a bit of communal feasting might help ease tensions and foster personal bonds. Long trestle tables were set in the great hall, the same chamber overshadowed by the Iron Throne at its far end. Servants brought roast boar, honeyed duck, fresh trout from the Blackwater, loaves of steaming bread, and flagons of ale and wine. Musicians played softly on lutes and pipes, their tunes echoing off the vaulted ceiling. At the high table, Maelon sat with Rhaegar Waters, Lord Corley Spire CH, and a few prominent delegates like Lady Meredith Hightower, Lord Anders Lannister, Bryce Tully, and the newly arrived Lady Rosalind Arryn. The conversation began politely, turning on topics like the harvest in the Reach, the tensions in the Vale, and the proposed blockade of the Iron Islands. As the wine flowed, tongues loosened. A sense of cautious camaraderie spread among them, or at least a temporary truce. Yet subtle tensions flickered. Lady Meredith Hightower leaned close to Maelon, lowering her voice so the others would not easily overhear. "Your Grace," she said, "I must commend your dedication to your great-grandfather's dream. But I wonder if you ever consider evolving it. After all, we are not the Free Cities, nor the Summer Isles, nor Karth. We are Westeros with our own traditions and histories. The Great Council is all well and good, but perhaps it needs more structure to function over the long term." Maelon tilted his head. "What would that look like?" She sipped her wine, eyes glittering in the candlelight. "For one, we might create a formal upper and lower division within the assembly, one chamber for the lords and ladies, another for commoners. Each chamber could pass or reject measures, and only those agreed upon by both chambers become law, subject to the king's assent. It would create a clearer system, one that accommodates the realm's class structures while still giving the small folk a voice." Rhaegar, seated nearby, overheard. "That might also let the lords block anything they disliked from the commoners and vice versa." Meredith shrugged, unruffled. "That's the point of checks and balances, isn't it? No side can dominate. Right now, we're all in one chamber, which makes the proceedings chaotic. Delegates speak over each other. Important measures get lost in the noise. The Great Council could become more effective if it had a bicameral structure." Maelon took a moment to consider this. Part of him saw the logic, a more refined system might indeed reduce chaos. But another part worried that splitting the assembly into two might create an entrenched power imbalance. "It's a compelling idea," he said cautiously, "but we must weigh the consequences. If the lords can always override the commoners, then are we not sliding back toward feudal norms? On the other hand, if the commoners have equal or greater power, some lords will cry tyranny of the mob." Meredith's red lips curved into a small smile. "Hence the necessity of careful design. Perhaps each chamber must pass a measure by majority, but the king can intervene to break stalemates. We can craft the rules so that neither side is powerless. Think on it, Your Grace. Stability is precious." Maelon nodded, lips pressed together in thought. "I will. Thank you for sharing your perspective." As the evening wore on, such private conversations flickered among the diners, forging alliances or sowing suspicion. Bryce Tully quietly asked Rhaegar for advice on how to coordinate the Riverlands delegates more effectively. Lord Anders Lannister whispered with Lady Florent about potential trade expansions in the west. Lady Rosalind Arryn, shy and graceful, confided in Maelon that the Vale hoped to build more watchtowers along the mountain passes but needed assembly funds to do so. He smiled, promising to review her proposal. The banquet ended on a subdued but generally positive note, the guests dispersing to their respective lodgings in the keep or scattered throughout King's Landing. Maelon retired to his rooms, mind churning with all he had heard. The idea of a more structured parliament tugged at him, both alluring and daunting. He realized that the Great Council in its current form was in many ways an improvised system, one that his great-grandfather had built hastily in the final years of his reign. It worked, but it was messy, reliant on the monarchy's moral authority to hold it together. If it were to last for generations, perhaps it needed deeper institutional roots, like the notion of having two distinct chambers. But such a reform could also unravel the unity they had fought to build. He lay awake long into the night, half wishing for Aegon's presence to guide him. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of swirling banners and unstoppable storms. Some weeks later, the threat from the faith militant zealots flared anew. One morning, a ragged group of pilgrims bearing the seven-pointed star marched through Flea Bottom, chanting condemnation of the assembly as the ruin of the divine order. They carried wooden staves and wore makeshift armor. According to city watchmen, they were led by a self-styled Brother Dawn, a fiery preacher who claimed to have visions of the seven commanding him to tear down the profane council. The watch moved to disperse them, but small scuffles broke out. A few were arrested, but many fled deeper into the warren of alleys. Word spread that these zealots had safe houses across King's Landing and that they planned a grand demonstration outside the Assembly Hall. Lord Corleyspire ch. the King's Hand strode into Maelon's solar that same afternoon with a grim expression. Your Grace, these zealots are growing bolder by the day. If we don't take decisive measures, they might incite a riot. It could endanger the delegates. Maelon frowned. I don't want to crush them without cause. They have the right to protest, provided they don't harm anyone. They've already harmed city watchmen, Corlys countered. At least 4 have been injured. A demonstration in front of the assembly hall could turn violent. King Maelon rubbed his temples. Then we increase security, separate them from the delegates. Let them shout if they must, but I don't want to give them martyrs. Ensure the watch stands firm and arrests only those who attack. Use non-lethal methods if possible. Corlys bowed, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Very well, Your Grace. I'll relay your orders. The next day, as delegates arrived at the Assembly Hall for a routine session on coinage and trade, they found a line of city watchmen stationed along the main approach. Beyond them stood a hodgepodge gathering of about 200 zealots, many in threadbare robes, brandishing wooden signs painted with slogans like, Bow to the Seven, Not to Mortals, and A King Without the Seven is No King. They chanted vehemently as the delegates passed, though the watch held them at bay with spears. Lord Torrhen Stark scowled as he climbed the steps, ignoring the insults hurled his way. Lady Meredith Hightower swept past with her chin high, refusing to dignify them with a glance. Hob the Nets flinched at their cries of traitor to the faith, but kept walking. All in all, the demonstration seemed contained. Midway through the assembly session, however, a sudden commotion erupted outside the hall. One of the zealots attempted to push past the watch line, screaming that he had a message from the Seven for the king. When the watchman blocked him, he swung a wooden stave, striking a guard's helm. The guard retorted with a shove of his spear shaft. Tension escalated in a heartbeat. Some zealots flung stones. Others tried to wrest the watchman's weapons away. The watch, on orders to remain measured, used shields and blunt ends of spears, but it was enough to spark a melee. Inside the hall, delegates heard the clamor, shouts, metal clangs, the thud of bodies colliding. A small folk representative from the Stormlands turned pale, muttering about old faith militant nightmares. King Maelon immediately called for a recess and ordered the doors barred from within to protect the delegates. He summoned Ser Miles, commander of the King's Guard, and instructed him to reinforce the watch with non-lethal tactics if possible, but to ensure no breach occurred. Rhaegar Waters went with Ser Miles, determined to help quell the riot. Outside, the confrontation had spilled into a nearby square. Zealots clashed with watchmen, though many on both sides hesitated to shed blood. Some watchmen were devout themselves, uneasy about striking men who claimed to follow the Seven. Yet the riot took on a life of its own. Brother Dawn, identified by his wild eyes and red hair, stood atop a broken cart, raving that the king was a false shepherd who served the assembly's heresy. Stones flew. A few watchmen sustained serious blows to the head. A random bystander was trampled. Smoke rose from a small fire where an overturned brazier had ignited some straw. Rhaegar Waters arrived with a detachment of additional guards from the Red Keep, each carrying a cudgel or a shield. He could hardly believe the chaos he saw. Men and women chanting, swirling around in panic, some fleeing, others lunging forward, the watch forming defensive lines. Over the din, Rhaegar shouted, "Hold! By order of the king, cease this madness." Brother Dawn's eyes snapped to him. The zealot leader thrust out a hand. "You are the devil's spawn, minion of the false king." He leapt down from the cart, brandishing his stave. "We are commanded by the warrior to tear down the seats of mortal arrogance. Step aside or face the Father's judgment." Rhaegar held his ground. "Stop. This is your final warning." He tried to remain calm, but tension coiled in his gut. He had witnessed conspiracies and seen blood spilled before, yet seldom in such a raw and chaotic manner. Dawn bellowed a wordless cry and rushed forward. Rhaegar blocked the swing with his shield, feeling the jolt rattle his arm. Two more zealots joined in, shrieking about holy vengeance. The watchman near Rhaegar intercepted them, grappling and driving them back. Within moments, the watch managed to beat them to the ground with clubs. Rhaegar's shield dripped with the dust and sweat of the melee, but no lethal blades had been drawn yet. He forced himself to exhale, grateful they were avoiding outright slaughter. Off to the side, though, a cluster of zealots had cornered a watchman, backing him against a stone wall. One raised a broken piece of timber, preparing a lethal strike. Rhaegar dashed forward, swinging his shield. With a thud, he caught the zealot's arm, throwing off his aim. Another watchman joined him, subduing the attacker. The pinned watchman gasped in relief, falling to his knees. The riot ebbed as more watch reinforcements arrived. Some zealots fled, others surrendered. Brother Dawn, battered and bleeding from a scalp wound, tried to rally his followers anew, but their momentum was broken. In a final act of defiance, he slashed wildly at a watchman with his stave, only to have the watchman crack him on the head with a cudgel. He collapsed unconscious. Smoke from the small fires drifted across the square, swirling around the aftermath of shattered stalls and scattered debris. When the fracas had quieted, Rhaegar oversaw the rounding up of captives, ensuring no more brutality than necessary. His heart thundered in his chest. This was the first large-scale violence in King Maelon's reign, a frightening reminder of how tenuous the peace could be. Nearby, a mother wailed over her teenage son who had been caught in the melee. A quick check revealed the boy was alive but badly bruised. Rhaegar ordered a maester be sent for. All around, the hush of shock replaced the roar of conflict. City watchmen looked shaken, exchanging glances as if to ask, how had it come to this? King Maelon soon emerged from the assembly hall with Ser Miles and a few delegates at his heels. He took in the scene, spilt blood on the cobblestones, broken timbers, the odor of smoke and fear, and his face tightened. At length, he spoke to the watch captain. "Have all arrested rioters confined. Let them be fed and tended for their wounds, but keep them under guard. We will see them tried properly for disturbing the peace and injuring others." His gaze flicked over the unconscious figure of Brother Dawn, who was being bound at the wrists by two guards. "And that one? He led this madness?" Rhaegar nodded. "He calls himself Brother Dawn. We'll know more when he wakes." "So be it. Ser Miles, see him locked in the dungeons. I want to question him myself once he's coherent." The calm in Maelon's voice carried a severity that reminded Rhaegar of Aegon at his fiercest. The young king clearly did not relish violence, but he would not tolerate an uprising that threatened the assembly's work. The delegates who had accompanied him seemed relieved that the riot was quelled. Yet a pall hung over them all, the knowledge that some fanatic had turned faith into a weapon against the new order. It underscored once again how fragile all of this truly was. In the days that followed, the city watch maintained an increased presence around the assembly hall. Brother Dawn and his chief lieutenants languished in cells beneath the Red Keep. When he finally regained consciousness, the king interviewed him in a private chamber, accompanied by Rhaegar, Ser Miles, and a few scribes. Dawn refused to kneel, spitting at the floor in contempt of the false monarchy. He ranted of visions from the Seven, proclaiming that the assembly was the beast with 7 heads from the ancient prophecies. Maelon tried to reason with him, citing scripture about the duties of a king to serve the realm, but Dawn would not hear it. He claimed the rightful order was for the High Septon to crown a chosen king who ruled unchallenged by mortal assemblies. When pressed, Dawn admitted that a group of pure faithful still plotted deeper in the city, awaiting a sign to strike. He named no names. Frustrated, Maelon had him removed. Though it pained him, the king ordered that Dawn be sentenced to life imprisonment for sedition and incitement of violence. A public trial was held before a panel of judges drawn from the assembly, some lords, some commoners. They reviewed evidence of the riot, heard from watchmen and wounded bystanders, and unanimously found him guilty. On hearing the verdict, Dawn held that the Serpent Council would meet its doom soon enough. Yet he was dragged away to a cell to spend his days in darkness. Some in the realm criticized the king for not executing him. Others, especially among the small folk, praised the mercy. Either way, the tension in the city settled for a time, though rumor insisted that the faith militants still harbored fanatics in the shadows. Meanwhile, the assembly pressed on. The blockade strategy against the Ironborn was finalized and narrowly passed a vote in the main chamber. The monarchy would dispatch the royal fleet, joined by local fleets from the Westeros and the Reach, to patrol the seas around Pike, harassing known raider strongholds. Merchants willing to trade with smaller Ironborn ports could do so provided they complied with an inspection regime. Any sign of cooperating with Greyjoy reavers would end that port's access to mainland resources. It was a careful strategy designed to isolate the Greyjoys without condemning all Iron Islanders to starvation. Maelon signed it into law, sending Lord Daemon Valerion to orchestrate the mission. He departed King's Landing with the Queen's blessing, Maelon's mother, a Targaryen princess who still lived in the capital though no longer sat on the throne. Daemon's departure reminded everyone that events beyond the city would also shape the assembly's fate. The new coinage measure took effect slowly. Why? The Crownlands mint producing coins featuring King Maelon's profile on one side and the golden scales on the other. Old coins remained in circulation, but taxes in some regions would only be accepted in the new minted currency or its equivalent in measured gold or silver. Money changers sprang up around King's Landing, adjusting exchange rates. The realm adapted as it always did, though a certain friction remained among the older lords who favored the coins minted under Aegon. Still, no one could deny that a stable currency might help unify the markets across Westeros. Amid these structural achievements, personal dramas also played out in the assembly's corridors. Ambitious lesser lords schemed to gain influence over committees. Commoner delegates jockeyed to secure re-election in the next cycle by delivering results for their hometowns. Alliances formed between houses that once were bitter rivals, united now by shared economic interests or ideological leanings. Some more conservative, some more reformist. Maelon watched all this with cautious fascination, aware that the monarchy was no longer the only political force in Westeros. The realm was becoming a tapestry of shifting coalitions, bound by votes and debates rather than by the threat of dragonfire. One late afternoon, as Maelon concluded a private meeting with Lady Rosalind Arryn about Vale funding, he found Rhaegar waiting in the corridor. The young man's face was alight with excitement. "Your Grace," he said softly, "I've just received a raven from the north. It's from Rabar Mormont, the nephew of Lord Stark's wife. He writes that a group of free folk from beyond the wall have approached the giftlands near Castle Black, asking for refuge. The Night's Watch doesn't know what to do. In the past, they would have turned them away or captured them, but these wildlings come bearing news of a harsher-than-usual winter." Maelon raised an eyebrow. "A harsher winter?" "The seasons are always unpredictable, but if it's truly severe, the North will need provisions, not to mention the possibility that more free folk might cross the wall to escape famine. This could be a crisis or an opportunity." Rhaegar nodded. "It might require the Assembly's intervention to decide policy for the Night's Watch. The Watch usually stands apart from politics, but if the wildlings come in large numbers, we need a plan." The king murmured, "It's yet another reminder that governance extends far beyond King's Landing. I'll call for a special hearing. We must consult the Northern Lords, the Assembly's committees. Perhaps we can find a more humane approach than just driving them back to freeze." The notion stirred in Maelon an echo of his great-grandfather's convictions. Aegon had once spoken of unifying all under one realm, though at the time he meant it by conquest. Now, maybe unity could mean compassion. Recognizing that even the free folk beyond the wall were part of the same land, the same future, if they chose to be. Of course, many northern lords would object. Fear and old grudges did not vanish overnight. But the assembly allowed for these conversations to happen openly. Perhaps that was the difference. In the subsequent session, Maelon formally introduced the matter of the free folk to the Great Council. He read from Rabar Mormont's letter. They claim the winter's wind is sharper than any in living memory. Their herds are dying, and their clans are scattered, forced to seek shelter south of the wall. They come peacefully for now. If we turn them away, do we risk provoking more aggression down the line? Or do we attempt to integrate them? This is not merely a local northern issue, it concerns the realm's unity and the Watch's role. Predictably, opinions diverged sharply. Lord Torrhen Stark, though sympathetic to the plight of the free folk, worried about letting large numbers cross. My ancestors fought them for centuries, he reminded the assembly. Hard to set aside that history. A northern commoner delegate from Deepwood Motte argued for compassion. A hungry man is desperate. Let us offer them settlement in the gift lands under certain conditions, loyalty to the realm, no raids. Better to have them as allies than enemies. A Stormlander knight scoffed, allies? They don't follow our laws or our faith. They're savages. Several delegates bristled at the word, but the knight pressed on. Why risk trouble? Send them back. The room rumbled with debate. King Maelon listened, letting the lords and delegates argue. Eventually, he proposed establishing a formal committee, once again, to gather testimony from the Night's Watch, from the northern lords, and possibly even from free folk representatives themselves, if any could be brought south. The assembly would then decide on a policy. While some grumbled that forming another committee was a way to avoid a hard decision, most agreed that a rush choice could have dire consequences. And so the matter was tabled. Even as that issue simmered, the realm braced itself for rumored storms. Maesters across Westeros began to note the shift in winds, the cooling of nights, the shortened days. They predicted that a new winter was indeed coming, and possibly a long one. With that, the Great Council found itself consumed by the question of how to stockpile grain and other essentials. This time, Lady Florent from the Reach and Lord Anders Lannister from the Westerlands took the lead, proposing a realm-wide levy of surplus harvests to create a strategic reserve under the Crown's supervision. Dorne offered gold in exchange for guaranteed shipments of certain produce. Tensions flared over the details. How much each region must contribute, whether the Crown or the Assembly would administer the stockpiles, how to ensure fair distribution. But the memory of past famines lent urgency. After weeks of haggling, the Council approved a Winter Provisioning Act, funneling resources into newly built granaries in key locations. King Maelon oversaw the signing of the measure, feeling a glimmer of pride that they could act collectively to face such threats. Amid these weighty affairs, life in King's Landing wore on. Taverns bustled with gossip about the new king, the next elections for commoner delegates, and the rumored approach of a severe winter. Performers roamed the streets, offering satirical renditions of assembly debates. In a sign of changing times, a new playhouse opened in the city, built with partial funding from the Great Council, touting itself as the People's Theater. It promised free entry one day a month for those who could not afford the price. Is this not madness? A few conservative lords murmured, but the city folk flocked to it, enthralled by stories that no longer only glorified the highborn but occasionally portrayed humble blacksmiths and farm maids as heroes. A quiet revolution in culture accompanied the political one. Yet not all was harmony. Whispers still circulated of covert alliances forming between certain lords who longed to see the monarchy restored to absolute power and believed Maelon too gentle to do it. Others whispered of clandestine commoner groups who thought the monarchy was an outdated relic, that the assembly should become a full republic, dethroning House Targaryen. Maelon's precarious position was to steer between these extremes, keeping the realm afloat. Rhaegar was often his confidant, and their late-night conversations roamed over the dangers of radicalism on both sides. They concluded that the best defense of the system was its continued success, proving to the realm that shared governance yielded better results than tyranny or anarchy. As the first snows dusted the rooftops of King's Landing, a mild flurry, unusual so far south, the assembly prepared for its next big test, the re-election cycle for commoner delegates in the Crownlands, the North, and Dorne. Each region had its own schedule, and these three were up for new terms. The question was whether the small folk would return the same delegates or clamor for new faces. Since Maelon's coronation, the public had seen not only improvements like roads, new coinage, and famine planning, but also riots and complicated compromises. How would they judge the performance of their representatives? In the Crownlands, Rhaegar personally observed some of the public assemblies held in marketplaces. The process varied by locale. In one town, prospective delegates stood on a wooden crate and gave short speeches, promising to champion lower taxes or better roads or some other popular cause. Then the townsfolk dropped tokens into a marked chest to indicate their vote. In a larger settlement, literate scribes tallied written ballots. Emotions ran high, with rumors of bribery, intimidation, and cunning deals struck behind the scenes. It was messy, but it was happening, the small folk selecting their champions, forging a link to the realm's highest legislative body. King Aegon's final dream was alive in the muddy streets. When the results trickled in, Hob the Nets, the fisherman who had spoken up so many times in the assembly, lost his re-election by a slim margin to a younger fisherman who promised to push for even more radical reforms. Some mourned Hobbes' departure, calling him a moderating voice of reason. But Hobbes himself accepted the outcome gracefully, telling Rhaegar, "The people want change faster than I delivered it. That's their right. I only pray my successor does well by them." Rhaegar was moved by Hobbes' quiet dignity, seeing the true spirit of democracy in his acceptance of the people's verdict. In Dorne, the re-election sparked lively gatherings in the plazas of Sunspear and the outlying towns. The Dornish delegates had proved influential in the assembly, especially in forging alliances on trade and the blockade of the Iron Islands. Many were returned to their seats, though a few lost out to new voices who demanded that Dorne get an even larger share of the realm's tax revenue, citing a historical pattern of being slighted by the Iron Throne. Such sentiments hinted at ongoing regional rivalries that the assembly had yet to fully transcend. In the north, the re-election process was hampered by distance and weather. Some smaller communities near the Frostfangs and the Shadow Tower simply didn't participate at all, lacking a feasible means to send votes or candidates. Still, in Winterfell, White Harbor, and other major centers, elections proceeded. Several delegates were reaffirmed, including one who championed a more open-door policy for peaceful freefolk. But a handful of new delegates were staunch traditionalists, suspicious of the monarchy's southern entanglements. One new representative, a grizzled hunter from near the Last River, openly voiced that King Maelon's father had too much southern softness. It remained to be seen how that tension would play out. When the re-elected and newly elected delegates arrived in King's Landing for their first session, Maelon welcomed them in a modest reception. The great hall bustled with fresh energy, a swirl of new faces mingling with the old. He offered a short speech. "We come together once more as lords and commons alike to serve the realm in these uncertain times. May we uphold the will of the people with wisdom and courage." Polite applause followed. The new delegates eyed the grand surroundings, some awestruck, others resolute, determined to make their mark. On the second day of the new session, the assembly tackled the matter of the Free Folk Committee's findings. The Night's Watch had sent representatives to testify, including a black-robed ranger named Adhel, who spoke solemnly of the rising snows and the sorry state of the free folk who had crossed the wall. "They're hungry, more keep coming, and some bring their grudges with them," he said. "But others only want to survive. If we push them back north, we might face raids and bloodshed. If we let them stay, we must feed them, house them, and watch them." The assembly listened in rapt attention as Adhel described the precarious situation at Castle Black, Eastwatch, and the Shadow Tower. Lord Torrance Stark emphasized that the North was already bearing a great burden from the heavy snows, which had begun in earnest now and might not stop for years if the winter were indeed a long one. "We can't handle an influx of thousands," he warned. "We need help from the rest of the realm if we're to integrate these free folk." A new Crownlands delegate, the young fisherman who'd unseated Hobb, proposed that the assembly allocate resources from the Winter Provisioning Act to feed the free folk, on the condition they settle peacefully in designated areas near the wall. Others balked, arguing that the precious reserves were for recognized subjects of the realm, not outsiders. The debate lasted into the night. Some lords invoked ancient tales of wildling raids, the kidnapping of northern women, the savage conflicts of the past. Others urged compassion, pointing out that these free folk might become loyal subjects if treated fairly. The presence of a single free folk spokesman, invited by the committee, added a startling dimension. He was named Tormund Stoneskull, a thick-bearded man with laughter in his eyes and scars across his hands. When granted permission to speak, he said, "I've shed blood, aye, but your folk have shed ours too. We want no more fighting. The cold kills us all, south or north of your wall. Give us a chance and we'll stand by you if a worse threat comes." That last phrase, "a worse threat," hung in the air. The free folk sometimes spoke of legends beyond the wall, old evils that stirred in the deepest cold. Most Southerners dismissed these as myths. But something about Tormund's tone unsettled even the hardened cynics in the room. King Maelon studied him, wondering at the truths hidden in northern lore. After another day of deliberation, the assembly passed a resolution, narrowly, to allow a limited number of free folk to settle in the gift under the supervision of the Night's Watch and Northern Lords, with partial financial support from the Realm's Provisioning Act. They would be required to abide by the King's Peace, pay reduced taxes if they farmed the land, and refrain from raiding. Any who violated these terms would be turned over to the Watch or local lords for judgment. It was a halting, imperfect compromise, but still unprecedented in its acknowledgement that the free folk might be integrated rather than treated as an eternally hostile force. Tormund Stoneskull expressed cautious gratitude, though he also warned that not all free folk would accept these terms. Some, he said, would remain free beyond the wall, while others might resent being bound by southern laws. Only time would tell if the arrangement would hold. But for now, the immediate crisis was addressed with minimal bloodshed. As winter deepened, King's Landing experienced unusually cold winds, though no massive snowfall blanketed the city as it did the north. The great council sessions grew more subdued. Travel became more difficult for delegates from distant regions, slowing the pace of legislation. Yet the assembly continued to meet. They passed laws regulating the distribution of winter reserves, offered guidelines for fair dealing with traveling merchants, and instituted new rules against price gouging in times of shortage. The seeds of a more stable society were taking root, though some pockets of resistance remained. The Iron Islands were still blockaded, with House Greyjoy refusing to yield. Reports indicated the blockade was slowly squeezing their reaving capacity, but they had not surrendered or petitioned to join the assembly. King Maelon found himself increasingly occupied with the daily tasks of governance. His nights grew shorter, his face thinner, though he was far younger than Aegon had been in his final years. Rhaegar urged him to pace himself, but the king seemed determined to ensure no crisis went unaddressed. That determination began to attract a new measure of loyalty from many delegates, even those who had doubted the monarchy's sincerity. He was forging a role that balanced the old Targaryen gravitas with the new ethic of collaborative rule. And yet he was also aware that this new ethic required constant vigilance, lest it collapse under either tyranny or chaos. Late one evening, in the quiet of his private study, Maelon sat by a low-burning brazier, reviewing a letter from Lord Daemon Valerion, who was off commanding the blockade near the Iron Islands. Daemon wrote that certain small island lords like House Saltcliffe and House Goodbrother were beginning to chafe under Greyjoy's dominion, especially with supplies running low. Some had quietly approached the blockade ships to negotiate secret deals for food. It hinted at potential cracks in Ironborn unity. If handled carefully, it might lead to the realm's eventual success in pacifying the islands without a massive war. As Maelon set the letter aside, Rhaegar slipped into the study, carrying 2 cups of mulled wine. For warmth, he said softly, offering one to the king. Maelon accepted with a grateful smile. They sipped in companionable silence for a moment. Then Rhaegar observed, "You're forging a path through thorns, your grace. But you are forging it. The blockade is working, the free folk crisis is contained, the faith zealots are quieter now that Brother Dawn is locked away. The realm might survive this winter after all." Maelon nodded, though he felt the weight of countless unknowns. "I only hope that in forging this path I'm not sowing seeds of new conflict. House Greyjoy might grow desperate. The zealots might regroup under a new leader. And in the north, if the free folk settle in large numbers, we could see new disputes." Rhaegar's gaze held steady. "Every victory carries risks. But that is the nature of this new system, is it not? We face problems openly, not by hush or hidden decree. Your great-grandfather believed the realm could handle it if we all had a voice. And if he was wrong?" Maelon asked quietly, eyes on the dying fire. "What if the realm only functions under strong rule? The more I see, the more I realize how fractious and stubborn men are." Rhaegar placed a comforting hand on the king's shoulder. "Aegon was not wrong. Look how far we've come in just a few years. Wars that once would have erupted are now handled through negotiation. People who were voiceless now have delegates to speak for them. The realm is at peace, even if it's a fragile peace. That alone is worth defending." Maelon closed his eyes. He pictured Aegon's final moments, the old conqueror on his deathbed, urging the realm to stand together. "Yes," he said softly, "it is worth defending, and so we shall." They finished their wine, letting the warmth seep into their bones while the winter wind howled beyond the walls. By the time they parted ways, the brazier's coals were nearly spent, but a quiet glow remained, stubbornly refusing to die out. So too, Maelon thought, did the flame of this democratic experiment persist in Westeros. It might flicker, might threaten to collapse under the weight of tradition, zealotry, or ambition, but for now it burned on. And as the night deepened and a hush fell over the Red Keep, King Maelon silently vowed that he would keep it burning for as long as the gods granted him breath. Over the next months, the shape of Westeros continued to shift. Reports from the blockade indicated that House Harlaw was in secret talks to break from Greyjoy's leadership, possibly even to petition the crown for a separate peace. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, the Great Council tackled a major reorganization of the city's administration and attempt to root out corruption among the harbor officials, a cause championed by newly arrived delegates from the Crownlands. The debate was lively, for city governors had long enjoyed a measure of autonomy and some among them had grown rich off bribes and skimming. But with the Assembly's new powers, they could pass laws forcing transparency, requiring harbor fees to be audited by Crown-appointed clerks. The measure passed, though not without fierce resistance from certain entrenched interests. A few threatened to sabotage the process. But the City Watch, under orders from the king, supported the reforms. Slowly, changes took effect, saving the crown coffers from embezzlement and winning more credibility for the assembly among the city's populace. As winter wore on, flurries dusted the city sporadically and supply caravans from the south arrived less frequently, hindered by the cold. The granaries funded by the assembly began to distribute wheat and barley to the needy. In Flea Bottom, lines of people formed each morning to receive ration bread. The measure, though not overly generous, prevented starvation on a mass scale, a marked improvement from previous winters when only the wealthiest or luckiest survived easily. The people whispered thanks to both the new king and the memory of Aegon, who had sown the seeds of this transformation. In the north, the free folk arrangement proved challenging but not disastrous. Lord Stark reported some tensions, cattle thefts, disputes over property lines, but with oversight from the Night's Watch and the help of local delegates, violence remained limited. More free folk trickled across the wall, and many accepted the new settlement terms. Others roamed off, preferring the old ways, but so far no major raids had occurred. The Assembly's policy, while imperfect, staved off open conflict. Some in the north grumbled, though, muttering that the southern lords had no business meddling in northern affairs. But the new northern delegates, many of them re-elected, argued that the Assembly's resources had helped build storehouses and feed not just free folk but northerners as well. The realm's interconnectedness was gradually taking root, however unevenly. And always, beneath the surface, was the knowledge that the monarchy had not relinquished all power. Maelon still commanded loyalty from many highborn houses who revered House Targaryen's legacy. The threat of the crown's might was not gone, only less visible. A new generation of knights still pledged their swords to the King Guard still protected him, and the Red Keep remained an imposing fortress. Yet the Assembly's significance grew day by day. Some foreign envoys, most notably from Bravos and Pentos, visited King's Landing to see this strange experiment in Westerosi governance, curious whether it would collapse or flourish. All these currents converged one crisp morning in the Assembly Hall as Maelon prepared to address what might be the most significant question yet, the formalization of the Great Council's structure. Lady Meredith Hightower had spent months drafting a proposal for a two-chamber parliament, while others favored preserving the existing single-chamber model. A few radicals wanted to diminish the monarchy's role further, turning the king into a largely ceremonial figure. The time had come for an open debate on how the Great Council would be organized for generations to come. Lords, ladies, and commoner delegates crowded the hall, the air thick with anticipation. Maelon sat at the dais, flanked by Rhaegar and the scribes. Overhead, the banners of the participating regions fluttered. With a crisp gesture, the king signaled for silence. The murmuring quieted. Members of the Great Council, he began, voice echoing. We gather to discuss the next step in the realm's governance. My great-grandfather, King Aegon, established this assembly as a single body where lords and commoners might meet. It has served us through war, conspiracies, riots, and the coming of winter. But many of you have expressed ideas for refining its shape, ensuring it endures beyond my reign and beyond the memory of even Aegon. Let us hear those ideas in open debate. Lady Meredith rose, her emerald gown shimmering. Your Grace, esteemed delegates, I propose we create two chambers, one composed of lords, the other of commoners. Each chamber to pass legislation independently, with a measure becoming law only if approved by both, then receiving royal assent. This arrangement ensures no single faction can dominate. It reflects the realm's history of noble leadership while preserving the new voice of the people. A short flurry of applause arose from some corners, while others sat stiffly. An older commoner delegate from Dorne stood next. And how are we to ensure the commoner chamber is not perpetually overshadowed by the Lord's wealth and influence? If both chambers must agree, the Lords can block anything that benefits us and we'll be stuck with the scraps. Meredith lifted her chin. We could include provisions preventing undue delay, perhaps a time limit for each chamber to pass or reject a measure. If the Lords keep blocking a widely supported bill, they risk the monarchy's intervention or the people's anger. And if the commoners block everything the Lords propose, they too must face consequences at re-election. A young blacksmith delegate from the Westerlands scoffed. That's all well in theory, but the Lords can outspend us and bribe delegates, can't they? Money still speaks louder than words in many corners. A lord from the Vale rose, replying that corruption could be found on all sides and that accountability measures were needed. The debate whirled. Some lords praised the idea of a separate noble chamber, seeing it as a safeguard against what they called demagogues. Others expressed concern that it would create new bureaucratic tangles. The conversation ventured into details of apportionment, length of terms, and the monarchy's veto power. From his seat, Maelon watched keenly, occasionally interjecting a question or guiding the debate. He didn't want to impose a solution unilaterally, ironic given he was king, but he wanted them to craft something lasting. This might be his greatest legacy, ensuring the realm's democracy wouldn't depend solely on a single benevolent monarch. After hours of back and forth, another proposal emerged: keep the single-chamber model but institute standing committees composed of both lords and commoners to refine legislation before it reached a final vote. This was favored by delegates who feared a strict two-chamber system would stunt progress. Look how many committees we already form for every crisis, said the blacksmith from the Westerlands. Why not make that official and permanent? Each committee can handle a domain: finance, defense, trade, justice. Let them refine proposals and the full assembly votes in the end. That way we keep a single unified body but gain structure. A flurry of discussion ensued, comparing the two-chamber approach to the committee's approach. Some proposed a hybrid. The hall buzzed with intensity as though forging a new constitution in real time. Maelon adjourned for the day, urging each faction to draft a formal resolution to be debated and voted on. Over the next fortnight, the hall became a crucible of ideas, alliances shifting as delegates weighed which system would best preserve their influence. Lady Meredith's two-chamber model drew strong support from noble houses but faced resistance from many commoner delegates. The single chamber with standing committees garnered broad appeal among the commoners and moderate lords but drew skepticism from those who feared it lacked enough checks on radical proposals. Meanwhile, a small minority argued for an even more radical system, some wanting to strip the monarchy of veto power entirely, others wanting to restrict or expand the commoners' representation. Tempers sometimes flared. Rhaegar lost count of how many times he had to gently intervene to keep the debate from collapsing into personal insults. All the while, King Maelon remained the calm pivot, letting each side speak and seldom revealing his own preference. He wanted a consensus that would stand the test of time, not a narrow victory that half the assembly would resent. Finally, the day of the vote arrived. The hall was packed. Delegates waited anxiously, scribes prepared to tally the roll call. Lady Meredith Hightower rose first, formally introducing her two-chamber resolution for a yes or no vote. The roll was called region by region. The lords from the Reach, the Westerlands, and parts of the North leaned in favor, while many commoners opposed. Yet some commoners from more conservative areas joined the lords, while a few lords from the Crownlands or Dorne opposed it. The final tally fell short of a majority. Meredith's resolution was defeated, though not by a large margin. The lady inclined her head gracefully, hiding her disappointment behind a polite smile. This meant the second resolution, the Standing Committee's approach, would be introduced next. Lord Corley Spire CH and the blacksmith from the Westerlands proposed the committee resolution, specifying that the Great Council would remain a single body but be subdivided into permanent committees for finance, defense, justice, and commerce. Each region would nominate lords and commoners proportionally for each committee, with oversight from the monarchy. The final legislative vote would still occur in a single chamber, ensuring no group could hide behind a separate house. The roll was called again, tension high. Many who had voted for Lady Meredith's plan now had to decide whether they would accept the committees as a compromise or oppose it in hopes of future changes. As the clerk read off the tallies, the votes in favor crept upward. King Maelon observed from his seat, outwardly composed, though his heart drummed a steady beat of anticipation. When the final count was announced, the resolution passed by a comfortable margin. Applause rippled through the hall, mixing with the murmurs of those who were displeased. Rhaegar exhaled in relief. The assembly had chosen a path that balanced structure with unity. Melon stood, quieting the crowd. "So be it," he said. "From this day forth, the Great Council will adopt permanent committees. May they bring order to our deliberations and strengthen our realm. Let each region nominate its committee members within a fortnight so we might begin the new session promptly." Lady Meredith, though disappointed, rose to speak. "Your Grace, delegates, I accept this outcome. I will serve on whatever committee I am placed, striving for the good of the realm. But let it be known that if the committees fail to contain the assembly's chaos, we may yet need a second chamber in the future." Some delegates booed softly, others nodded in agreement. She gave a measured curtsy to the king. Melon inclined his head, appreciative of her composure. And so the Great Council evolved once more, this time with official committees that would filter, refine, and shape legislation. It was not as drastic a transformation as some had wanted, but it was a step toward formalizing the system. Melon felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. The realm had chosen continuity and mild reform over a radical shift. Perhaps it was the safer path. Yet he also knew that no system was immune to corruption or power struggles, committees included. Still, the assembly had spoken, and for now, at least, the monarchy and the people would move forward together under the structure of a single-chamber parliament with specialized committees. Over the days that followed, the hall bustled as each region submitted names for the committees. Battles for key seats ensued, especially for the Finance Committee, which controlled the purse strings. Once again, alliances formed. Some lords promised support to certain commoner delegates in exchange for reciprocal votes. Others cajoled or threatened. The spectacle might have resembled a nest of vipers to some, but King Melon saw in it the messy vigor of a realm learning to govern itself. He did not attempt to micromanage appointments, though he did weigh in occasionally, suggesting certain men or women of proven integrity for the Justice Committee. In general, the monarchy's influence persisted behind the scenes, ensuring that no single faction dominated. This was the new dance of power, subtler than conquest, but every bit as pivotal. Winter's grip tightened, and the nights grew longer. King's Landing endured frosty mornings, though rarely did snow accumulate for long. In the north, records indicated that the free folk settlement was growing, but so were tensions. The Night's Watch requested more resources. House Stark remained vigilant. Meanwhile, the blockade at the Iron Islands continued, with rumors that House Greyjoy had begun covert negotiations to surrender in exchange for autonomy within the assembly. The times were changing, and even the Ironborn could see that raw defiance might end in ruin. One afternoon, in a lull between committee sessions, Rhaegar and Melon strolled through the courtyard of the Red Keep. Despite the chill in the air, the sun offered a pale warmth, and a few stubborn ravens perched on the battlements overhead. They passed the training yard, where young squires practiced archery, firing arrows at straw targets. Melon watched them with a faint smile. "I once believed my greatest duty would be to learn swordplay and dragon riding, like my ancestors," he mused. "Yet my true battles are waged in council chambers." Rhaegar nodded. "You're forging something far more enduring than a single military victory, Your Grace. A system that outlives any one king." They paused near an ancient tree that had been planted by Queen Rhaenys in the earliest days of the Red Keep. Its branches were bare now, dark silhouettes against the winter sky. Melon reached out, running his hand along the rough bark. "I wonder if one day we'll have no need of so many weapons if the realm can stand on law and mutual interest alone." "Perhaps," Rhaegar said, "but men's hearts are seldom free of greed or fear. Even in a system like ours, ambition stirs. You see how they jockey for committees, bribe for influence." "And yet," Melon said, turning toward the main keep where the Great Council convened, "it's better than the old cycle of war. The realm unravels in open conflict, or we cower under an all-powerful king. This is a new path, uncertain, but it allows for voices that once had none." He gazed at Rhaegar. "You recall my great-grandfather's last words. He said the realm was all of us, that we succeed or fail together." "I remember," Rhaegar answered gently. "I will never forget." They continued their walk, stepping over bits of frost-laced gravel. The wind carried faint echoes of the city beyond the walls, the hum of daily life that the assembly now touched more intimately than any regime before it. When they reached the end of the courtyard, Melon paused, scanning the distant sprawl of King's Landing, the smoke curling from countless chimneys, the labyrinth of streets. He inhaled slowly. We have come far, he murmured. But we will need courage for what's yet to come. Rhaegar placed a hand on the king's shoulder. We shall find it, your grace. The dream lives on. And so it did. Beyond the horizon, winter raged, free folk sought refuge, Ironborn resisted or schemed, and zealots plotted in the shadows. But within the capital, a single bright flame of collaboration persisted, nurtured by a king determined to honor the legacy of his great-grandfather, a conqueror who discovered, in his twilight years, a kinder way to rule. Each day, through argument and compromise, that flame was stoked. Each day, the realm took another uncertain step toward a future shaped not just by the might of dragons, but by the voices of its people. And as the final chill of that day's wind gave way to the possibility of another dawn, the history of Westeros continued to be written anew, line by line, bill by bill, heart by heart, forging a democracy that, for all its flaws, stood as a testament to the power of hope, vision, and perseverance.